Okay, everyone, it's 1:01. We're going to get this started. So I want to first thank you for being here today and having you here to kick off the first National New Professionals Conference is a big, huge success for us. So I am currently at IPAC National. My name is Ashley Cabral. Some of you may have known me in the past as the chair of Toronto Region and the co-chair of IPAC National's Insight New Professionals Committee. I'm very excited, as I mentioned, to be leading our first ever New Professionals event. And our New Professionals events are based on the outcomes of helping you learn, grow, and engage. And today's agenda, as you all received, and as well as in the website we'll share with you on our chat feature, is packed. And we're really excited and thankful to have our expert speakers here to share their knowledge with you. So I will like to start off this event with a prayer. We are joined by Darian Adjugate to lead us in prayer.
Oh, Dante Kakio. Hello, everybody. Darian Adjugate in my name's Darian Adjugate. Kausas is Kunganik na Peochi, and I come from the Kausas First Nation. Today, I'm going to say a prayer for all of us. So if you want to pray in your own way, in your own language, or just listen to me, then whatever seems fitting. But I'll say a prayer for all of us in my language. I speak the Cree language. I'm from Saskatchewan here, and so we have the Cree language over here. So I'm going to speak my Indigenous language and do a prayer. So I say, Mamo taima katipe chigin. Nananasko teno ma no chikisaga kamiayak. Napago se tamwa wakakia ayesi ino akmio pimatsu in kaya chik. Ego kaso emia kakia kanagate maya kagawi no aski esewasko yako. Kise manto, kunanasko mitananko takisaga emiayak. Sagaste no kisi na mao mostamoa migusuacha kita nagatoyema oskawa sasagwa kita mietsi pe tamun. Sawa no kisi na mao mostamoa pagosisacha kita nagatomeat oskaya ego kita miet kisi watsu. Pagisimo ta kisi mao mostamoa oskawa mostosacha kita nagatoyema o kisagopegwa ego kita miet si pe oesun. Ki wait no kisi na mao mostamoa masquachak kita nagatoyema ki teaya ego kita mitsa gitwin sa meka kiao kiwagumaga ninwak kananas ko mitanano ma kisaga kamyayak kananas ko mitanano ma pematsun kamyayak ay kisimanto. And what I said there was just a simple prayer in a language, giving thanks for today, being thankful to be able to be seeing today. And what I said was more so, I hope that everybody here is able to have a good life and that we're able to care for Mother Earth as we go along our ways through life. And I did a prayer to all 4 directions because I know we come from all different places in this Zoom meeting. So I did a prayer for every direction. And I prayed to the different spirits that we believe in Cree culture for them. And then I just prayed so that we could kind of bless all of us, bless all our relatives. That's what I said. So please bless all of our relatives, including your relations and mine. That's all I wanted to say. I'm all done the prayer. So thank you guys. Thank you all for listening and interested to hear what I'm going to be saying in this meeting here. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I grew up I grew up on my reserve there, but I didn't learn my language until later in life. So I'm just picking up the pieces. But thank you for the opportunity for me to say the prayer.
Thank you for your words and your blessings and for welcoming us from Regina Treaty 4 territory. At IPAC here, we are dedicated to fostering an environment for continued learning, to engage, grow, and future leaders of tomorrow. And that is all of you. You are the leaders of public service. So this event is an example of the type of discussions IPAC encourages throughout the year. At IPAC, we create a space for you to learn throughout your career journey. So we encourage you to post your attendance today on social media. We've added our social media channels on our chat. Hashtag us at IPAC NP 2021. And I would like to call on Paul LaFlèche, our IPAC president, to offer a few greetings to you.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm pleased to be here at the first National New Professional Seminar. I am from Nova Scotia, and sometimes I just say I'm the Deputy Minister of a whole bunch of stuff. Attending today's conference provided you already with an opportunity to become an IPAC member. Having the distinct honor of being the current year's president of IPAC, I'm excited to tell you what it means to be part of the IPAC community. IPAC is a professional association for public servants, academics, and industry experts to connect across all orders of government, the country, and the world. That includes municipal, Crown Corps, federal, provincial, territorial, etc. IPAC creates a space for people like yourselves, a space for professionals who are passionate about public administration and public services, a space for you to share ideas and experiences, to collaborate and discuss emerging issues in the public agenda. You are part of this national community of public services. IPAC members are united by their passion to learn, grow, promote public service excellence, and to give back. IPAC aims to provide members with networking events, social engagements, and professional development opportunities. From personal experience, I know that IPAC is the best professional association for public servants. IPAC has been around for over 75 years, and it's dedicated to support you. I have been an IPAC member for many years. One of your speakers, Tony Dean, and Senator Tony Dean, and I were colleagues many years ago as clerk and secretaries to cabinet in different provinces. Tony went on to the Senate, and I went on to become the Deputy Minister of Seniors. I don't know who got the better deal. But this leads me to share with you the most exciting news yet. We are preparing for the 75th anniversary of IPAC. There's a celebration coming in September 2022. I want to personally invite you all to join us at this celebration, whether in person or virtually. I know that our 75th anniversary celebrations are not to be missed. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Ashley.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for those encouraging words. And just so everyone knows, you being here today gives you 1 year membership to IPAC. So not only are you benefiting at this event, you're going to benefit from every other event that's going to come up in the next few months and in the year. And it's a great way to keep on networking, grow your network, and grow your skill set. So we want to also thank our sponsors for supporting us at this event. Without their support, this would not have occurred. As some of you know, in your own event planning experience, it takes a lot of work to plan an event. And these sponsors, as you see on the slide here, has supported us to get to this stage. So I'd like to name them, if you mind. York University School of Public Policy Administration, MLT Atkins Western Canada's law firm, Johnson Shoama Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Regina, Saskatchewan, the Personal Home and Auto Group Insurer, Udemy Business, Museo La Grasa, Gen Next York Region, Government of Manitoba, University of Toronto Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Carleton University School of Public Policy Administration, Silo Strategy, Ryerson University Public Policy Administration Graduate Studies, Seneca, and Govern Next Nova Scotia. So once again, thank you very much to our sponsors for supporting us. I also would like to encourage you to visit their websites and see what they have to offer you as an attendee. On behalf of IPAC, I wish to thank each organization once again for their continued commitment to public service excellence in Canada. So a couple of housekeeping notes as we're here in Zoom. So before we begin our discussion, We would like to know how we did. Please take a moment to fill out our survey. So that's going to be sent out in our chat feature. And finally, this is a conference after all, so please be sure to participate in our networking sessions after the conference each day and meet other participants across Canada as well. So let's begin our conversation right now and start the skills development of this period. So our first keynote guest was appointed to the Senate of Canada as an independent senator in November 2016. Tony Dean has had an extensive career in the public sector and is here to share his knowledge surrounding the rise of his career. So let's join Tony to moderate. Joining Tony, to moderate this session is our IPAC 2021 Promising New Public Servant Award winner, Alicia Arnott, Senior Advisor to the Assistant Deputy Attorney General, Indigenous Justice Division in the Ontario Public Service. So we'll have time for audience questions after Tony provides his keynote speech to all of us. We ask that you put your questions in the chat feature. So over to you, Alicia and Senator Dean.
Thanks, Ashley. Just trying to figure out, okay, I think we're good. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me. Before we get started, I just wanted to say hi miigwech to Darian for that beautiful opening prayer, and to welcome you all to the first keynote presentation for IPAC's new professionals event. My name is Alicia Arndt. I'm a member of the Mohawk Nation from Six Nations of the Grand River, and I was born to the Bear Clan. As was said, I'm currently the Senior Advisor to the Assistant Deputy Attorney General of the Indigenous Justice Division at the Ministry of the Attorney General here in Ontario. As a new professional myself, I'm pleased to be the moderator for this session and hope to sit with you all and learn with you all over the next 30 minutes or so. Ashley beat me to it a little bit, but I would like to take a few moments just to introduce you to today's keynote speaker. As was mentioned, Tony Dean was appointed to the Senate of Canada as an independent senator in November of 2016. But he's formerly a professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto, now the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Senator Dean continues his association with the school as a distinguished fellow. Senator Dean has advised governments in Canada and internationally on public administration and public service reform, and has chaired several expert panels at the federal and provincial levels. From 2002 to 2008, he was Secretary of Cabinet and head of the Ontario Public Service, where he was responsible for a workforce of 63,000 public servants. Senator Dean has written on public sector reform and leadership in the public sector, and his book, Building Better Public Services, was published in 2015. He's a member of the Order of Ontario. In conversations leading up to this keynote event, Senator Dean shared with me that he much prefers to be referred to as Tony. So with respect for that and with gratitude for taking the time to speak to all of us today, I'd like to invite Tony to share with us a little bit about his career and his journey through leadership in public service. So over to you, Tony.
Thanks very much, Alicia, and thank you also to Ashley, Paul, and to Darian. It's a kind introduction, and let me thank IPAC as well, and especially David Fulford for the invitation to join you today. There is nowhere I would rather be than having a conversation with Canada's public servants. And those of you who might be considering a switch to a public service job, it really is a great privilege to join you. And I want to start, as I always do, by thanking you first for the hard work that you do every day in serving the public. You have tough and important jobs, and you make a difference in the lives of citizens and clients of government services. Whether you work in a policy job, a program job, or in frontline service delivery, or in the important area of internal services, providing services to one another like HR or finance, you make a difference every day. And the services, by the way, that I've just covered are what I consider to be the core areas of government business. As public servants, each of you hold an important responsibility in your hands. to protect the public interest, to provide your very best advice to the government of the day. You have unique jobs. They're hugely important jobs. And you make a difference every day, whether you realize that or not. I've walked in your shoes from a policy advisor at Ontario's Ministry of Labour, a job that I loved and what I would have been happy to retire out of, and through a range of jobs before my role as Cabinet Secretary and head of the OPS in Ontario. As you've just heard, the CEO of a workforce of 60,000 staff, responsible for encouraging the best of them, for bringing out the best of them, for making an effort to create an environment in which those people could flourish, and sometimes protecting them, and sometimes dealing with performance issues, because not all of us are at our best all of the time. I still think of myself actually as a public servant, despite the more political nature of my work in the Senate. And I'd say to Paul that I am working for seniors as well at this point, and I'm working among seniors in the Senate. As I work with other independent senators and other senators to reform the Senate, I rely almost entirely on my experience as a public policy professional to bring evidence and a public policy lens to our work in reviewing government legislation. I did this when I sponsored the Liberal government's cannabis reform bill, Bill C-45, which just passed its 3rd anniversary. This was incredibly fascinating and reminded me of the sort of rich fabric of the policy issues that we deal with in government. This had huge scope. It touched on public health, reducing the impact of criminalisation, and also on disrupting Canada's sizable illegal cannabis market. So it had an economic lens as well. And I've also taken my public service experience into my work on the Senate's Board of Internal Administration, where we've developed a more rigorous workplace harassment prevention policy. We've got a new financial audit committee with external oversight for the first time, and which is important. And one final piece of these reforms that I want to see completed is having a single point of accountability for leadership of the Senate's administrative staff. First question I asked, who's in charge here? Who's in charge of the administration? When I hear 3 people, it makes me nervous. We need single points of accountability. We need to see where accountability lies, an important lesson in leadership. I likely wouldn't be in the Senate without my public service experience, and I certainly wouldn't be able to contribute as much without my experience in Ontario's public service. And I can say this, as you wonder where your career is going, and it sometimes seems to languish or not be what you hoped or expected, you never know what's around the corner. This is the nature of government. It's the nature of public service. Within a year of being hired as a policy advisor at the Ministry of Labour, there was an early election call, and in a very unexpected turn of events, Bob Rae was elected as Ontario's first New Democratic Party Premier. Everybody was shocked, including me. Bob Rae was elected with a commitment to Labour relations reform, and because of my Labour background, I was asked to manage the project for the government. I happened to be the right guy at the right time. But that was a key step in moving me through the ranks of the public service and eventually into the office of Cabinet Secretary and head of the public service. And my Labour background followed me even into that job, because I was often asked by premiers to figure out, get involved, provide advice on how to resolve big and thorny political or Labour relations disputes that had taken on a political nature. I'm going to briefly talk about public services in Canada and the context in which we do this work. Some key skills and attributes that public servants need today and going forward. And I'm also going to touch briefly on leadership, but you're going to be hearing much more about that later in the program from my friend Brian Marson. First of all, the context in which you do your work, even before the pandemic. the collision of citizen expectations that are burgeoning. Citizens expect more and more and need more and more from government, clashing against government's ability to fund those services. Seniors, autism, mental health, poverty. We used to think in government that some of these issues like poverty were intractable. That's the way we describe them, can't be solved. But issues like poverty have simply become too expensive to ignore. So poverty reduction is moving more and more into center stage in the world of government, public policy, and indeed politics. 24/7 media, intense scrutiny, gotcha politics, the search for scandal, plus somewhat of a shift away from what we used to think of as evidence-based policy towards evidence-informed policy, which leaves much more room for more voices, and indeed is perhaps more representative of the political decision-making process. It makes the life of political leaders a cauldron. You know about this. It makes your life a cauldron sometimes. And the world can change for a cabinet minister on the short drive from a constituency office to a venue, a speaking venue, in the space of a tweet. That's how fast the world is moving for our political leaders. You know more about this than I do at this point. But it makes for just-in-time policy making and delivery very often, which in turn drives the need for very, very special and different skill sets. Many of you are in the middle of this maelstrom, and you likely have very, very tough jobs. In fact, I know you have very, very tough jobs. And sometimes you might feel a bit rudderless, and we'll come back to this in a moment. What can we do about this? Well, first of all, to go back to basic first principles, the government of the day has been elected, and no matter how good they are, and I've worked with good governments, great governments, or how they can occasionally screw things up, our jobs are the same: to serve them to the best of our ability. Our jobs don't change when governments change. In fact, sometimes they get a little bit tougher because we have to demonstrate our worth and demonstrate the trust factor all over again. They are more important. And our values don't change as we switch from a Liberal or NDP to a Conservative government and back again, because our jobs are unique. They're about safeguarding the public interest, not serving politicians, yes, but not serving a political interest, serving a public interest. And that makes your jobs a highly virtuous profession. Nobody else gets to do that. You do. You have the expertise, you have the qualities necessary to protect and improve public services. So, where's this taking me? As new professionals in this context, be your very best in serving the government every day. As is the case with every government, we build trust and confidence one day at a time. With a new government, a minute at a time. And that trust and confidence can be lost very, very quickly, and it takes a long time to regain it. It will nevertheless, and you'll find this as you move through your careers, it will nevertheless sometimes be necessary to speak truth to power, as the saying goes, which is a euphemism for providing information to politicians that they'd rather not hear, but which is nonetheless vital to eyes-open decision-making, or because it might touch on a legal or constitutional issue. And these are sometimes difficult moments which require us to, I'm going to use the term, step into the shoes of ministers or premiers and think carefully about the language we use. Use our emotional intelligence, because it's vital nonetheless that we get these messages across. And better a tense, brief, and sometimes perhaps not very pleasant encounter than being asked later, why didn't you tell me? You should have told me that. We need to be at our best in serving citizens, the second major client of government services. It's what we're here for. And we should be looking constantly for ways to improve public services to citizens. And as I said earlier, we have to be at our very best in supporting one another. Both those who work in, if we're in program, we support policy. If we're in policy, we support program. We all support those who are providing internal services. And we need to remember to support one another in moments of challenge, to encourage one another when we might be hit with a change in direction after putting a ton of work into something, like a cabinet submission that is shelved at the last moment. And by the way, don't worry about those things, because good ideas always tend to come back. It might be a sharp word from a junior political staffer, but look out for one another, because the small things that we do for one another in moments of trauma or discouragement are things that stay with people for a very, very long time. My next message is to you is that it may sometimes seem otherwise, but you're in a position to make a difference. Even in a risk-averse environment, and I hear a lot about risk in government, you likely have more room to lead and improve public services than you think. Very few work units, departments, or ministries are running optimally. There are issues and opportunities to make things better in your own environment. There are always opportunities to make services to citizens work better. It's that why do we do it that way moment that can sometimes turn into an opportunity to make a difference. And again, I'm going to say, in working with other departments, as we think about shortening policy decision-making processes and supply chains in our own and other governments. I'm thinking now about children's and mental health services, where we have lots of policy and program interaction. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, what about permission for changing and doing the right thing? If we ask any political leader, Premier, would it be okay if we do some work here to improve this program or this public service? The answer is, and I've asked the question, well, I thought that was your job. Our political leaders aren't thinking as much about risk as we do, but if there's an opportunity to improve a public service, there's always a political dividend from that. So let's be careful about passing risk and putting risk in its place. We need to manage risk, but risk should not stop us from doing the right thing. And as you become supervisors and managers, you have the ability to establish the tone and expectations around the freedom that people have to improve public services. And they do need that support from the top. And you also have a responsibility to provide them with the right HR support to enable them to continue to thrive in their careers. What do we need in public servants in the next decade? We need public servants who are fearless, who are principled, who are service-oriented. I use the term outriders. We need public servants who are comfortable crossing organizational boundaries, not staying close to home, playing close to home, but talking to colleagues in other departments, in other ministries, outside of government, at other levels of government, checking in, touching base, developing relationships. Those relationships always result in dividends. It might take some time, but those connections are hugely important. Another important skill that we need is the ability, and you're living this now, to gather data and evidence from a wide range of sources, assess, combine, sift that data into useful inputs for decision making. And you are now doing that faster than ever, and we've got to do our best to get that right. That leads a little bit into what I talked about earlier in the difference between evidence-based and evidence-informed policy. We'd like to have evidence-based policy made all the time. But as good as we're going to get, because that involves political decision-making, is evidence-informed decision-making. And that means opening up the field of inputs to provide political leaders with a broad range of information, including information that they may not have asked for and they may not particularly want, but they need to know where opposition is likely to come from in order to keep them out of trouble. Comfort in speaking truth to power. This is not about saying, you know, Minister or Prime Minister, I think you're going to screw this up. It's about being emotionally intelligent, and it involves putting yourself, ourselves, in the shoes of that politician and thinking about the way they're going to receive this information, which isn't always good news for them. As supervisors and managers, you're going to need to think about the ability you have to influence the working environment that you're operating in for the better. Are the right people in the right jobs? Are we managing performance appropriately? Are we motivating our staff? Are we clearing the path with other departments to work efficiently? And once we move into supervisory and management jobs, it's important to delegate in order that others can develop their skills. In my first supervisory job, I really wanted to bring the best parts of my previous job into the new one. I loved those parts of the job. They were really fun, but I wasn't in that job anymore. And I soon realized that I wasn't going to be able to take on the true supervisory and managerial skills that were asked of me now if I was carrying part of that job. So it gets delegated, and delegation is very important. Now, briefly, I'm going to talk about government transformation. During my middle time in government, and certainly when I was the cabinet secretary, we talked a lot about transforming government. And a big push at that time was to complete the integration of front counter service delivery, which started about being able to move front counter services to from ministries to common counters, Service Ontario, Service New Brunswick, Service BC. There was a lot of resistance to this. We used to call it the lost wallet problem, because if you lost your wallet, you had to traipse around town to, you know, the Department of Environment, the Health Department, the Environment, the Municipal Council Office. This idea based on the lost wallet was to put all of those services behind common counters. And that was successful. There was a lot of resistance. Big, powerful ministries like the health ministry here in Ontario said, well, you know, we can't let go of health cards. That's stuff that is highly confidential and only we can do that. So it took a lot of pushing. It certainly took a lot of pushing from me as cabinet secretary to make that happen. And then, of course, we wanted to bring the municipal services in behind those counters as well, which was fairly easy. But the effort to bring the federal government with their passports and with social insurance numbers behind those common counters was huge. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out where that resistance was coming from. Eventually, I learned that it was actually about the loss of ownership of front-facing services, because the federal government is more limited in its outward-facing front counter service delivery than is the province, and certainly at the municipal level. We overcame that resistance, and I did this with a senior government minister in a one-on-one meeting in my office by saying, well, look, you know, we'll put your flag on top of the building. We'll put your logos on the front door. You will have all of the signage you want. You'll have all of the recognition you want, because this is what local MPs were worrying about. I was reminded about this, and you might think about this too, have thought about it already. The logos on our vaccine certificates. There was a lengthy delay as the federal government and provinces tried to figure out, is it going to be provincial or federal? And you will have noticed that on top of your vaccine certificate are both logos. That was a compromise. And when we moved beyond this then, and we're talking now about 15 or 20 years ago, away from frontline service delivery that is transactional and about health cards and birth certificates, to the more complex world of integrating human services, which is an ongoing project. It touches on health, it touches on mental health, poverty, homeless, addictions. And this is where the bulk of budgets are. This is where the spend is, and this is where the demand is. And where demand is outstripping the ability to pay for it, we've got a big problem. And this is also an area, this area of complex human services, whereas, we still say clients of government services are falling through the cracks. Well, those people who work in health and human services, I've got a pretty good idea where those cracks are. Cracks aren't random. Cracks just don't appear. They're part of the architecture of the system of service delivery that we have in public services and in governments. So now we're hearing more and more and more and more about wraparound services, about locally based and multi-agency responses to difficult challenges. We've still got a lot to do in that area. I'm going to finish very, very quickly now by mentioning briefly human resources practice. If you haven't thought about a career in the HR side of government, you should at least give it some thought. It's really important. I think it's relatively undervalued, but it touches on everything that is important in an organization, from recruitment, onboarding, compensation, incentives, performance management, culture change, how we change the nature of the organization. And on that note, I'm just going to, a one-liner here, two things that everyone needs to know in any organization: why they are there. I need to know why I'm here in this workplace, what's expected of me, and I need to know how I'm doing in relation to expectations. If you're a supervisor, if you're a manager, if you're a leader, you want to be able to say to yourself that my staff understand these things. Lastly, on leadership. Leadership needs to be conscious. It's not about an add-on job to our previous job. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes dedication, it takes focus. We leave our last job behind. We delegate. Leadership is about making a tough assessment of our organization, choosing 2 or 3 high-value areas or issues to improve. And no organization is perfect. Some are much better than others. But most people in organizations know what needs to be fixed. And as a leader, it's important to ask them and listen. Develop and communicate a compelling vision, your own vision of the organization. People are expecting that from you. Get the right people in the right jobs. And to do that, we need a really good, high-functioning HR function. Mitigate risks so that people are free to be inspired in their work and look to do things differently and better. And lastly, staff take their lead from you. As a supervisor or manager or leader, you set the tone for the organization. People are watching how you work. They're watching what's important to you. And they're kind of emulating that in many respects. So you don't want them emulating the troublesome side of your character. You want them emulating the very best of it. And there's no better place to end than that. I do hope that we've got some time for questions. And again, thank you for allowing me to join you today.
Thank you, Tony. I think we do have a few minutes for questions. Before that, I just want to say thank you so much for your generosity in sharing such personal, but also such practical advice and insight. You know, I mentioned earlier that I'm a relatively new professional myself, and in working for the Ministry of the Attorney General in Ontario, really spending a lot of my days navigating the silos within my own ministry, but also within the public service more broadly, and between different levels of government. So just on a personal note, to say that that was really helpful for me, and to express my gratitude. Before I ask the first question, we do have a couple of questions for you. I just want to remind participants that I'm keeping an eye on the chat, so if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in there. But the first question I have for you is, what advice do you have for a new professional who's looking to begin a career in public service but hasn't found their doorway in yet?
Well, please do not stop trying. I waited a couple of years with on again and off again signals to get that first job in the Ministry of Labour. But I stuck with it. I stayed in the job that I had. I continued to develop my skills. I checked in to show every now and again to show that I was still interested and I was ready if they were. If you can't get the perfect job, the job that you ideally want, have a second or third choice. Be prepared to shift away. Absolutely. You go after the job that best suits your skills and your interests and attributes. If that perfect job isn't available right now, find one that is, because there's lots of mobility once you get inside government.
Yeah, such helpful advice. Thank you for that. The next question we have for you is really focused on you and your career and your own learning and development in your career. And with everything you know now, is there anything you'd wish you'd known when you began your career in public service?
Well, it's such a tough question. Look, I will be honest in saying I had a very blessed career. I went further, faster than I ever thought possible. And I mean, it was great. So this is one of the reasons that public service jobs are really interesting. There are unpredictable career paths. I would say that my biggest learning, and I've touched on it, is that in the first job that I had, I carried too much of my old job into it. Secondly, I could have been a tiny bit more ambitious. I mean, we achieved a lot. But looking back and thinking about how much was achieved, and I guess it's now knowing what works, I could have achieved more. That's why it's important for me and other leaders and former leaders to share this sort of experience early, so that you can optimize your pathway through. But I have absolutely no reason to complain about my career in the public service. I worked hard. That put a strain on my relationship at home. It was tough. I had a lot of stuff to make up. It exacted a price sometimes in terms of my health. But I went into work every day as exhausted as I was the night before, as though I'd just plugged myself into a charging station, and I was bright-eyed and fluffy-tailed, ready to get back at it. And that's because I understood how important this work is. And if we don't do it well, nobody else is doing it. These are unique jobs, and we really have to be at our best every day. It took me some time to learn that, but once I learned it, it made a big difference for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely can relate to your comments on strained relationships and overall health and well-being. I do see we're running low on time. I'm going to ask one final question, and then depending on when the music starts to play us off stage, ask you to offer any final words or comments. But we do have a participant question that says, How do you observe the priorities of the new public servant in navigating the demands of public service in light of changes as a result to COVID?
Well, look, this isn't my world. I've got a neighbor next door who's shut inside 12 hours a day in a public service job. I know a little bit about what that's like. There are benefits and there are disadvantages to the nature of work as it's changed. We get to spend a bit more time at home, but we lose the ability to connect with one another with one another at work. But when I talked about crossing boundaries earlier on, the ability to connect virtually with those at other levels of government and people across the country is much more available to us now, and we're much more comfortable with it than we were earlier. As we come out of COVID, we should be thinking about what we want to carry forward and what we definitely want to put back in a box and lock it away until something like this happens again. There will be some benefits from this experience in all sorts of ways, including the way that governments have pulled together. And we don't want to lose the best of those and default all the way back to normal. So there should be conversations about what can we keep, what needs to be put back on the shelf for a while.
Thank you so much once again to Senator Dean for your generosity in speaking to all of us today, and thank you to all of our participants for your engagement. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the questions in the chat. We did our best with the time we had. But with that, I see we're now just a little overdue on our time, so I'll turn it back over to Ashley and our host. Thanks again, Tony.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Tony, for that very inspirational speech. And it's okay going over time. That's what happens when you have a very authentic, honest conversation. I was furiously writing down notes. And before we head into our health break, I just want to mention to the attendees today, public service is in everything we do. It's not individualized. It's in every facet of society. And I think COVID-19 really put a light to that, a flashlight to how we need to work, not in silos, but together as a community. And one of the biggest things, I always bring it back to IPAC. One of the biggest things about IPAC is we give you that access to different levels of government and across Canada of their public servants to learn from one another, because someone from Vancouver probably is dealing with the same issue that someone is dealing with in Toronto. So thank you very much for that inspirational speech. And it's not easy being a public servant, but it is a virtuous and it's a really good position and career to be in. So thank you very much, Tony, and thank you, Alicia, for doing that moderating session. So as I mentioned, we're headed into our health break. So be sure to get up, stretch your legs, refresh your drink, and grab a quick snack if you're hungry. And we'll be right back at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So welcome back, everyone. Again, this conference could not be possible with the support of our conference partners. Sponsoring today's event supports IPAC schools to engage, learn, and grow our IPAC community. I also just want to let folks know you're more than happy to go on camera if you feel more comfortable. So feel free to turn on your video. So moving on to our next session is on authentic conversations. Where do we go from here? Here we have a very frank conversation hearing from senior executives across Canada on how their field of work has changed or been impacted by COVID-19 and what that means for the future of public service. This session is sponsored by Johnson Shoema Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Regina and Saskatchewan. I welcome Dr. Lolene Berdahl, the Executive Director of the school, to the virtual stage to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Great, well, thank you and welcome everyone. My name is Lolene Berdahl. As Ashley mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Johnson Shoema Graduate School of Public Policy, and we are located at the Universities of Regina and the University Regina and Saskatchewan. And it's my pleasure to be your moderator for this session. Just as we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today, and I live and work on Treaty 6 and Treaty 4 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. And we pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I would like to provide a brief introduction to our panel. I'm going to introduce all of our panelists at once and then jump right into the questions. The way it's going to work is all the panelists are going to give about a 3 to 4 minute answer to a question. And then we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A from all of you. So as people are speaking, please feel free to find my name in the chat. Again, that's Lolene Birdall, and send your question to me, and I will be monitoring that. So our panel, I'm very excited about our discussion today. Our panelists include Hilary Hattel. As the head of the Ontario Digital Service within the Ministry of Finance, Hilary is responsible for leading the government's digital transformation efforts and the administration of the Simpler, Faster, Better Services Act to deliver simpler, more easily accessible services for the people, communities, and businesses of Ontario. Philippe Thompson is also on our panel since July 2019. Philippe Thompson has been the Chief Finances, Results, and Delivery Officer at Indigenous Services Canada, and he is responsible for providing leadership and ensuring effective management of departmental finance, and the sector is the departmental lead on integrated planning, results and delivery, parliamentary reporting, and provides facility management, security, and procurement services for the whole department. Dan Batista is joining us. He is the Executive Director of the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service, and he leads a dynamic team of professionals that help public sector organizations pursue service excellence through research, measurement, and benchmarking, learning, and collaboration and professional development. Drew Lafond is joining us as well. He has worked in nearly all aspects of the commercial side of cannabis. He has worked in licensing retailers in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. He was raised in Treaty 6 territory and is has been working with the government of Alberta for 7 years, and she provides market intelligence and support to Alberta firms pursuing international projects funded by international financial institutions like the World Bank. And her professional work experience involves working in the United Nations in Ethiopia, working in a Canadian NGO for 6 years in Kenya, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Peru, and with a consortium of Canadian universities, including the University of Alberta. So welcome to all of our panelists. And with that, I'm going to jump right in. And our first question is going to go to Drew. So Drew, decolonization and reconciliation are critical issues facing Canada. How can new professionals help to advance these imperatives?
Thank you very much for the question. I just wanted to give my reflections in two capacities in this regard, and that's coming not necessarily from the role that I fulfill in my day-to-day work, which is as a partner of a law firm in practicing as a solicitor on a day-to-day basis, which is largely commercial law, contract law, working for and on the other side of the table of Indigenous groups, but more specifically in connection with my role as the president and board member of the Indigenous Bar Association. Right now, we're a not-for-profit organization comprised of Indigenous judges, lawyers, academics, and students across Canada. We have about 400 members currently registered, and we have a strong communication network of people, Indigenous professionals who work with, again, like myself, with Indigenous communities, but also on the other side of the table. And before I get into it, actually, I'm initially from Saskatchewan, and I have to acknowledge I'm joining you today from Coast Salish territory and giving homage to my alma mater, University of Victoria here. So thank you very much for the invitation. And just to get back to the question, one of the things that the Indigenous Bar Association undertook in the last 18 months with the onslaught of all the questions that we were getting in connection with COVID and how it was going to be impacting Indigenous communities and how we push forward with reconciliation was a response that needed to be data-based and fact-based. So we partnered with the University of Saskatchewan Department of Native Studies in order to conduct a survey amongst all of our members, all 400 of them, to try to come up with some real and meaningful feedback and observations about what it means now to work with Indigenous communities post-pandemic in a new world of reconciliation focused on the perspectives of Indigenous peoples. And the research started, we ended up getting SHRC funding and a sizable grant to undertake the work in conjunction with the university. We ended up having a really good team appointed, very capable individuals who had on the ground knowledge, but also that academic experience that lent a lot of legitimacy to the work that we're doing. And we're expecting the final report to be released next month. The preliminary findings of our research, and this comes from a variety of different sources in academia, but also surveys of our members and people who are involved in the profession, was that going forward, working with Indigenous peoples is going to be extraordinarily different in a lot of areas, but primarily the recognition and assertion and exercise of jurisdiction over some key industries in Canada. And that includes the assertion over land-based resources, assertion over data. There's going to be a lot of talk about data sovereignty in the near future here. When it comes to the criminal law on Indigenous peoples, and obviously we have 30 reports that or 21 reports, inquiries, and commissions that have been commissioned over the last 20 to 30 years, specifically dealing with the question of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the justice system. We all know there's overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples at all levels of the criminal justice system, and underrepresentation in the administration of the justice system. So another area of jurisdiction that's going to be front and center is jurisdiction over criminal law. So Indigenous jurisdiction over dispute resolution systems, over policing in Indigenous communities, having more Indigenous peoples appointed to the bench. And we recently just concluded a campaign where we were trying to get an Indigenous jurist appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada. And so these are things that are squarely within the minds of Indigenous peoples and the people who are advocating on their behalf. So post-pandemic, I think it's going to be extraordinarily interesting to see the jurisdictional boundaries get challenged and overturned and reshaped and reformulated in the wake of what we're seeing here today. So that's, I think, in broad strokes where I think, and this is based on our preliminary findings of the report that will be released very shortly, but like I said, a very general overview of what I think to expect in the future here.
Thank you very much, Drew. I appreciate that. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat for me. I will be watching for those. Our next question is going to go to Philippe. Philippe, what has COVID-19 meant for public service delivery? And what should new professionals expect moving forward?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you so much for inviting me today. Je voudrais commencer par reconnaître que je me trouve à Gatineau présentement sur le magnifique territoire non cédé de la nation autochtone, the indigenous. I'm sorry, like I have the Anishinaabe First Algonquin. Sorry, I was like lost in translation. So the Algonquin, the Anishinaabe First Nation, was trying to do it in French to recognize the territory in Gatineau. So thank you so much for the question. This is a great question because service delivery is in the branding of an organization we are called Indigenous Services Canada. And for us, if we take us back at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know exactly what we were getting into. At the time, we didn't know if we would be in there for 2 weeks or 2 months, and it ended up being 2 years. So we had to be extremely agile and responsive in the way that we responded to the pandemic very early on. And it kind of hit us across all of the business lines of the organization. So we are delivering health services, education services, income assistance, emergency management. We have infrastructure programming, assisted living. So all of the programs of the organization were impacted by the pandemic, and we knew that we had to be extremely quick in reacting. So all those months, it was feeling a little like shoveling in a snowstorm for us, because it was just kept like, we were trying to respond to the pandemic and it was just continuing to hit us on an ongoing basis. And I used the analogy at some point that it was a little like feeling like we were driving an ambulance in a war zone, because we had to keep an eye on the external, making sure that we were responding very quickly. So what we knew is that there's a lot of diversity in communities across the country, and they have very different realities. And what we want to make sure is that we give the flexibility to the community so that they can make their own decisions on how best to respond to the pandemic. So what was very important was the humility to know that we were not necessarily the best to make the decisions for the Indigenous communities, but that the funding to allow them to be agile and responsive had to flow very quickly. So the key term here is risk management, because I didn't often have the authorities in the budget to be able to flow the money to the community. So we had to risk manage the funding that we had, make risk management based decisions on how we could use our authorities and how we would be using the terms and conditions that we have and all the authorities that we have to be able to flow the money very, very quickly, so that some of the most vulnerable communities in the country were able to prepare themselves for the pandemic. And I think that was the recipe for the success for the organization, was that agility and responsiveness in being able to provide the flexibility and the funding that was required to implement all the mitigation measures that were necessary. But risk management, it means you have to understand what you can do, what you cannot do, when you're stretching the rules sometimes a little so that you are able to be agile, and at the same time being very, very transparent in the way we are doing it. So to me, it was very, very important all the way through the decisions that we were making to inform my colleagues, reach out to my network, talk to central agencies, Department of Finance, Treasury Board Secretariat, say, you know, I know that I'm stretching the rule in here, and this is the reason why I'm doing it. And I want you to be aware that I'm doing that. And I want to make sure you're comfortable that I'm doing this, because like, right now, it's a life and death decision, and we have to do it very expeditiously. When I'm referring to the patient in the ambulance, since the organization, as the CFO, was responsible for facilities management, all the buildings, the technology as well. I have the CIU under my leadership, and we were not ready to work in a remote environment. We didn't have the technology, we didn't have the connections, we didn't have the deployment of computers all across the country. Not every employee had a cell phone. We didn't have the bandwidth. So again, it was working very closely with partners, making sure that we would be able to increase our capacity to work remotely, equipping the employees, make sure we could provide continuity of service. So that was also like, just as we were supporting communities, we also had to make sure that we were supporting the department and managing our risks. So for the future future public servants, you know, I think that we will have more and more of those situations moving forward. So understanding the concepts of risk management, value-based decision-making is super important. Keeping the client in mind in the service delivery organization, because like at the end of the day, what are you trying to do for the population you're serving? And how do you make sure that the bureaucracy doesn't become an impediment to achieve the outcomes for the population you're serving? So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to additional questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Philippe. Hillary, we're turning to you next, so I hope you're ready. The question for you speaks directly to our audience today, and that is, how can new professionals work effectively in a remote and hybrid environment?
Well, thanks, Lillian. Thanks for the question, and thanks for folks having me here today. I do want to acknowledge that I'm in Toronto, which is traditionally a gathering place for many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'm in the area covered by Treaty 13, and as both an immigrant to Canada and as a colonizer, I want to pay my respects to the Mississaugas of the Credit. This question, I think, can't be more relevant, and also is a great follow-on from Philippe's previous comments, because I think there's a couple pieces here. And one is, if you're lucky enough to work in a place that has done that work that Philippe just talked about, in terms of the workplace setting you up for success with the tools, with the the expectations and the communication avenues, then I think you'll have more success. So hopefully we're doing our jobs for you, because it's critical that organizations keep a pulse on employee sentiment and adjust accordingly, trying to understand what tools are going to make them more successful. I know a lot of teams across the Ontario Public Service are feeling burnt out from the lack of distinction between work life and home life. And we're trying to think about both the tools and the practices that will help us alleviate some of that stress, whether it's changing communication patterns and over communicating honestly, but getting into chat or Teams or Slack or whatever tool is at your service, to get out of email, to avoid unnecessary video calls, to avoid meetings. All of that has just been piling up on people, and it's important to assess as a workplace and as an employer how you're helping people be successful. But I think probably starting your career as a new professional during this period of hybrid work, of remote work, is probably a double-edged sword. I think new professionals might have an advantage on one hand, coming into remote workplaces. Those who were in university when the pandemic started had to pivot immediately into remote learning. And if you're coming into the workforce now, you have almost 2 years of remote school under your belt. So some of it will feel familiar. And then there's not having been in the traditional office environment previously. So you don't have any of those old expectations or, the way we've always done it built up. So maybe it's easier to adapt to a remote environment when you're not set in your ways and when you don't have that previous normal to compare to. But on the other hand, it absolutely it's difficult to join a new team, a new organization completely online. We've onboarded a ton of folks in the last 18 months, and it is hard work because you have to work just a little extra hard at making connections and ensuring people, regardless of their personality or their phenotype, maybe they're the kind that is going to reach out to everybody. But if you're not, how do you create those opportunities for people to connect? Meeting new colleagues who you don't work directly with on a team doesn't happen passively. So it really is all up to kind of personal incentive to reach out for those casual chats and figure out how to attend online socials. But all of this, I'm thankful that I can do this from my home and maybe not have to travel to a location to be at an event like this. But Zoom fatigue is real. And something that could have been a quick stop by someone's desk to ask a question turns into scheduling a meeting and finding time in the calendar. So I think it's about how we can set expectations and give people the tools to both communicate and set that expectation of almost asynchronous work. So you don't have, setting expectations about when my work hours are and when I'm most productive and how I like to work. That's slightly different from how maybe we've quote unquote always operated in the physical workplace. I'll leave you with a tool that I have loved for some time, especially we've tried to, at the Ontario Digital Service, be a sort of remote first, a distributed first team for quite some time, just because we do have employees across Ontario, and we've got employees that telework, etc. And one of the tools that for kind of creating your team and sort of kickstarting your team is called the User Manual for Me. If you Google that, you'll find it, and there's a few different angles at it. But thinking about those questions of how you like to work, how you like to communicate, making sure your teams know that and level set. It's a great tool no matter what, but it has become vital, I think, in this time of distributed and remote work. So best ways to communicate with me, the best ways to give me feedback. So I'll be respectful. Hear it. Things I love, things I struggle with, all of those kinds of things to just set the framework, the expectation, and level set with your team. It's been, I think those kinds of tools have been really crucial.
Thanks, Hillary. I'm reducing the urge to Google that right now, because that sounds like an incredibly helpful tool. And a lot of what you were saying to me resonated very strongly with me, I should say. Abiola, there is increased attention to issues of representation, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the public sector. What opportunities and challenges should new professionals be aware of with respect to EDI?
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to also say thank you for the invitation. I am speaking from Edmonton in Alberta, and I want to recognize as an immigrant and a settler that this is Treaty 6 territory, and there's also traditional territories of lots of First Nations, Anishinaabe, Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, and Stoney Nakoda. I think as my previous panelists have alluded to, our world is changing, and our world in the last couple of months, and certainly in the last 2 years or so, has changed drastically. We've had the pandemic, COVID-19. We've had movements for social and racial justice with the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Time's Up, Truth and Reconciliation, Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, legacies of residential schools. We've also had Islamophobia, attacks on Asians, hate crime, and a lot of discussions right now on mental health. All of this has shifted not just the expectations in terms of new professionals coming into the workplace, but I think for us as well, as not just as workers, but even employers, as to how are we showing up and how do we support our employees to show up in all their identities and to also embrace diversity of thought and experiences. And I think with those changes and external factors have come real opportunities. Right now, a lot of workplaces, both in the public and private sectors, are looking at adopting action plans and strategies that speak to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Apart from that as well, we are also seeing employee resource groups, lots of employee resource groups, certainly across the public sectors, to support our employees, but also to support policies and strategies that help make us a better, stronger workforce. I think one of the things I definitely want to stress for new professionals, and things I wish I had learned a long time ago or in my own start in the workforce, is about mentorship and sponsorship. There's a lot of opportunities out there for that. And when I talk about mentorship and sponsorship, not just don't look to people who look like you or have experiences like you. Actually look at people and go for people who have different experiences than you, if you can. I benefited from lots of mentorship later on in my last couple of years in the workforce, from really great minds and people who have diverse and different experiences than me. One of the things I also want to talk about is also looking at finding your tribe or band or your as I call it, personal advisory board. It's one of the things I'm part of, which came from a Women in Leadership conference, where we meet once a month, women from in this case a group of women from all across the government of Alberta, different experiences, different sort of political stripes, but we encourage each other, we share resources with each other, we help to find moral support, but then also answer questions and the challenges we're going through. I also say, stepping out of your comfort zone, putting your hands up for projects. I've benefited from being able to do, things like being the captain of the for bowling for corporate challenge. I knew nothing about bowling, but it was fun. You go to expand your network, and then raising your hands up, for projects that might intrigue you or might challenge you to grow professionally. So I think these things have been really helpful and are great opportunities, because I think right now we are seeing a new breed of professionals who are not only, they're taking action and not standing for bias. There's a Nigerian saying that my dad always talks about, and it says, you can't shave somebody's head in their absence. And it talks about representation and voice, and really looking around to see whose voice is missing, and how do you incorporate that into the way you work. I mean, that being said, there are lots of challenges, and there's still a long way to go. Some places adopt diversity and inclusion practices without necessarily, because it's sexy, it's trendy, without necessarily being intentional about it. So we still have a long ways to go in that sense. Wage, there's a huge, gender wage gap that's still there. There's still microaggressions that happen at work, but I would say I'm very much encouraged by, what's happening right now. And I think there is a lot to be, to look out to. And then I think, as a lot of my fellow speakers had talked about, there are a lot of tools that we can look out to as ways to improve how not only diversity in our workplace, but also how we show up and how we can be stronger voices for better policy, making. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I have one final question, and then I'm going to turn things to the audience. So I've been receiving some questions through the chat directly to me. Please keep those coming. Dan, you're up. What career competencies do you see as critical for public service career success?
Thank you for the question, Lolene. And before I answer that, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And of course, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on the territory and to speak to you today. That's a great question, and certainly one that probably needs more than about 2 or 3 minutes to address. But what I thought I'd do is sort of parallel my career in terms of, when I started 30 years ago to where we are today, and kind of the change. And earlier, if people had the chance to listen to Senator Tony Dean, he certainly outlined kind of, what makes an excellent or exceptional public servant, right? And kind of the toolbox, if you will, that you kind of come equipped with or need to be equipped with, right? So when I look back and I think about, when I first entered the federal public service many years ago, for me, it was this sort of notion that I had all the training I needed, right? And I was ready to go. And so all the traditional sort of, background kind of, finance, economics, policy, research, all the good stuff, right? But as the years went by, and certainly as we got into the late 90s, early 2000s, and the emergence of government online, I quickly came to realize that IT wasn't just for IT folks, right? And this notion that we had these computers sitting on our desks, and we had these wonderful but perhaps strange people who were the techies, who kind of understood all that, right? And for me, that was kind of the wake up, the realization that I needed to become digitally literate. I needed to feel comfortable having conversations about technology that went beyond simply desktop apps, right? And really for me, what that meant was retooling. I ended up going back and earning a second graduate degree specializing in computer science. And I'm certainly not advocating that that's what you need to do, but I think today's public servant really needs to feel comfortable talking digital, right? And I don't mean that you have to be able to program, code, do those things, but you have to understand what technology brings in terms of service and service improvement to the lives of citizens, right? And I think you also need to understand the not so good things about technology and how easy it is to be falsely sort of, given a sense of comfort that it will solve everything, right? So I think the first and most important thing is certainly acquiring that comfort with digital, right? And then really finding ways to be able to be in those conversations, because there isn't that divide anymore. There isn't sort of necessarily just policy and program people and then sort of, these IT folks on this side. I mean, you really now see kind of the emergence of people who are equipped to operate in that middle space, if you will. I would also add that over the years, I quickly learned that government doesn't have all the answers, and it certainly doesn't know how to get everything done on its own. So the notion of being able to partner, right, being comfortable partnering, collaborating, co-creating, and most importantly, going out and asking citizens what they need, right? What will make their lives better? How can we design a better experience? These were things that up until maybe 15, 20 years ago, were just not part of my understanding of what it meant to be a public servant, right? Because again, I think the traditional training 30 plus years ago in sort of schools, offering masters of public admin, obviously did not capture or anticipate the evolution that we've seen from, analog government to digital government, right? So I think for me, the biggest thing, in addition to sort of all the standard, competencies that you need. It's really about, the emergence of kind of almost a super public servant, right? Who is digital and comfortable and able to work, across a broader network and tap into certainly the citizens and those who consume, right, the services that are offered. So again, I think, my sort of quick summation here is that it is about constantly learning, constantly improving, constantly staying to the extent possible on top of what all these things mean, but never losing sight that we have to keep the citizen at the center of everything we do. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. One thing that you mentioned actually, well, not a lot of what you mentioned, brought me full circle back to a comment that Drew raised earlier. And Drew, I was just wondering, could you just tease out for us really quickly, and then I'll go to the audience questions. You mentioned digital sovereignty. Can you explain to the group what digital sovereignty is and why they might want to be aware of it?
Certainly. So as this reconciliation process continues to unfold, we're starting to see vast amounts of information being collected from First Nation communities, from First Nation professionals, First Nation employees, not only with respect to their lands and resources, but just generally individually about their identity, who their affiliations are with their families, their genealogy, generally their experience. The whole information, the gamut is being run, and there's a hunger that needs to be satiated for collecting Indigenous information about Indigenous peoples, so that we can help form a basis and help have an informed discussion about reconciliation. But one of the things that's not being sufficiently addressed as part of that large information extraction and analysis is where does the data belong? Where does the information, to whom does the information belong? Who has ownership rights over information that's making its way into institutions now for their own analytical use? Because just to use an example, to draw an example about what the IBA does and what my firm, MLT Aikens, a firm with approximately 650 employees, over 300 lawyers, operating in 5 different provinces. We're in a situation right now where we're 4 different provinces with offices, but we work all over Canada, sizable operations. And the amount of data that we collect and we analyze about our clients is it's astounding. I mean, we have an entire IT department that's responsible for collecting information from First Nation clients, if we have First Nation clients, finding out what the numbers of their memberships are, what the demographics are, what their specific sensitivities are, geographic concerns, access to lands and resources, all of these types of things work their way into our database. And then our IT people have extraordinarily sophisticated platforms and software to analyze, collect, and store that data. And this is just one organization that's working with Indigenous peoples. And a lot of the data, information, and confidential matters that come into our front door are supposed to be, and under the rules of the Law Society, the property of the client, and are supposed to be maintained in the client's best interests. Now, we're governed by very strict rules under the Law Society with respect to the collection, use, and disclosure of data. And we have vast amounts of it. And there's a lot of information out there about Indigenous peoples that even sometimes our clients don't necessarily know that they don't have, and there are rights in their information that they're not aware of. And I can't speak for every other organization out there, but there are a lot of Indigenous groups who are starting to recognize this and who are starting to say, stop. The collection, use, and disclosure of our information, or our private information, or any personal information about our members, or our history, or our lands and resources, or our future, or our business relationships, or partnerships, or income that we receive from the government. All of this is property in which they have a vested interest in keeping confidential or maintaining it in their own name. And we're getting to a place where that's not necessarily playing out as an intellectual property right, or they're not focusing necessarily on patents, copyrights, or trademarks. They're talking about the entire system that recognizes and protects rights and intellectual property. Should recognize an underlying sovereignty and an underlying ownership and a nation-based right to maintain that information and to maintain their rights and protection of that information. And that's starting to play out. I'd say it's in its rudimentary stages right now, but it's certainly something that people have to be cognizant of going forward, because these systems aren't things that Indigenous nations are going to be keen to start giving up on, especially when they start finding out how much data is actually being extracted from their communities and used for other purposes.
Thank you. So I have a question that wasn't directed at an individual, but I'm going to actually ask Philippe and Hillary to speak to this, if I may, because I think it falls right into what your work touches on. And the question is, do you think our need to adapt quickly to information technology has led to a diminishing of the quality of work in the public service? So Philippe, I'll put you on the spot first, please.
Thank you very much. This is a fantastic question, and I can't wait to hear from Hillary what she has in mind. I think, like, the productivity-wise, we have been very productive during the pandemic, and I think that from an efficiency perspective, we have demonstrated our capacity to be extremely efficient in using the technology. It had, like, for this period of time, it had kind of leveled the playing field, because we already had a national workforce and we already were using tremendously the technology to be able to communicate with each other. But we could see that there was really an unlevel playing field when there were people that were in person in the office and people were connecting through the technology. There was really an imbalance in the way that people were able to participate in the discussions. By the fact that we went all virtual, it kind of leveled that playing field. But it may be just a personal perspective, like I don't have any studies to back what I'm going to say. I would say that from an effectiveness perspective, things have moved very quick, but I'm not sure that the quality has gone up, because like we were like pushing stuff, like the things that we were approving, it was going extremely fast. And I think that there was a little less back and forth. There were no paper. So, and I find also that sometimes all the documents that we had to review on the screen, it's not the same. I know that there are studies, and maybe Larry can back me up with some true data on that, but I heard that there's a difference between revising things on paper versus revising on screen, or even from a learning perspective, it's not exactly the same effectiveness in terms of capacity to learn. So I think that we have become extremely efficient, but I'm not sure that on all aspects we have been more effective at everything that we have been doing. And I've seen a lot of people like saying like, oh, the world's never going to come back like before. And we have to still be a little careful with that, because what I was telling my deputies, because I'm responsible for technology and facilities and all of that, I use the analogy of playing hockey in boots. And I say, if you put all the kids in boots and they play hockey on the ice, on the ring, they will be able to compete and have a pretty good game. Put 5 kids on skates and it's a different game. Like the kids on boots, they can't follow anymore. And we have started going back to the office on some occasions. And I have to admit that the dynamic is different. So when you unlevel the playing field again, I think that we see an impact. And I will be very interested to see what's going to happen as we bring back people in the office and we unlevel the playing field, how it's going to play out. So Hillary, I can't wait to hear your answer on that one.
Well, I'm zeroing in on a couple of things in the question in terms of the need to adapt quickly to IT. And I'm assuming that the question is coming from a change in your tool set, from sitting in your office and maybe not having a laptop or not having a cell phone, etc. And then being sent home and, now you need a VPN and you need a laptop and you need your 2-factor authentication, all this kind of stuff. I will agree with Philippe. I think we in Ontario have been rapid in our response, have been eager, have been willing to invest. The one place where I think in terms of I would argue against the diminishing of quality, is that I do think that it's been a moment of so we have something called the digital service standard, by which we do assessments essentially of services that are going to eventually be online. So our digital service standard is 13 points that we help teams meet in order to create a successful online service. And I think actually what's happened through things happening very rapidly, there being a lot of investment, is that we've turned a corner in terms of working some of that into our machinery, honestly. And so I think, you can't say across the board that, quality is better, but I do think where digital teams have been empowered to do user research, to sort of do things right, if you will, we've been able to move the needle forward on kind of setting standards and expectations around delivery and around what great online service delivery looks like, so that we've been able to start small, iterate, do some of those things that teams kind of dream about, but haven't always had the space to do. But when we've been told, hey, this has to happen quickly, it has to happen in the next, week, well, that's how you get it done. You put out your minimum viable product and you start to learn from it. And then you build a team around it that can help start understanding the features that are needed. So I think in some ways, the rapidity and the crisis moment has actually helped us get some of that worked into the machinery of government in a way that I think sets us up to continue to get better and more effective. That's my hope.
Thank you. So I've got a number of questions here, one of which was about opportunities for continuing education. I'm just going to pop something in the chat on that front, and I see a number of links are being put there. And I'm going to go to a completely different question. And this is for Abiola. And so the question for you is, and I'll read it directly, how have you dealt with and overcome imposter syndrome as a public servant? So has this been something that you've had to deal with? And if so, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us at some point in our career and our lives go through that, right? You have this, am I worthy to be here? Do I have what it takes? So, as I mentioned, mentorship and sponsorship has been really important in doing that. I've always looked at other peers, other people to be able to, bounce ideas off of them and say, are you going through the same thing? Did you go through the same thing? How did you manage that? That's been really important. The personal advisory group I talked about, our advisory board I talked about, has also been really important in, building a network of different, I'll say like valued people, but, obviously different experiences, and, being able to understand where they've come from, where, where their journey, has taken them has been really important for me, and has really helped as well. And not only letting me know that, well, I'm not alone in this, I'm not going crazy. There are other people who are also, have gone through similar things. And I think the one thing, that also happens is as you come into your own, as you become comfortable in your own skin, and as you find, allies in the workplace that help you become comfortable in that skin, you start to develop that confidence and realize that I am here for a reason. I was hired for either my potential or my skills or my experience. So that's one thing I really, I try to impart on, especially, people I mentor, and people who, reach out to me, that, you're where you're meant to be, and you were hired for a reason. So don't second guess that. And I also say, don't do, your employer's job for them in terms of they have screened you in. So don't screen yourself out. Be there, be confident, and know that you have something of value to contribute and to put out there. There's a book, and I can't remember what the name of the book is. I'm going to think about it in a second, but it's all just about, that speaking to that imposter, syndrome, in terms of understanding the kick-ass person you are, and being, confident in that, and nurturing that. I think it's so important for us to be able to do that, because it's so easy for us to have that negative thought in our heads, but it just, takes the practice to be able to nurture the positive, reaffirming, voice to say, I've got what it takes. I'm imperfectly perfect and I will make mistakes, but I come out of it in a better way. So I think it's just really mentorship, reaching out to people, and don't keep it to yourself, right? Because somebody else is also going through the same thing, or somebody has a technique, that would help you. So yeah, definitely. Those are the things I would say have helped me in overcoming that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dan, this is a long one, but a good one for you. I'm going to read it directly. The major issue I find is, regardless of the new technology that is implemented into the workforce, new information management processes showcased, and innovative communication mediums being considered, senior leaders always, and that's in all caps, fall back on what they're used to and comfortable with. This practice is extremely disheartening and fatiguing for union staff. Real change occurs at the top of government, but senior leaders don't have real incentive to change since they are the key holders. Can there be any real change when the door is being guarded by those that are afraid of change?
So I'll start by saying this. Look at this panel, and I'm actually pointing directly at Hillary. So we do have leaders out there who get it, right? And I know it's tough and challenging, and I lived that through my career. And certainly I won't name any names, but a long time ago, a consultant I worked with said to me, we were trying to sort of be innovative and start move things online. And this consultant said to me, Dan, they don't get it, they won't get it, and that's not going to change until you've got people like you at the top. Well, unfortunately for my career, I didn't get up to the top and become one of those people. But having said that, I know it seems that way, but I think leadership can be found at all levels, right? And then I think it's your approach to how you innovate and how you bring about change. Yes, ideally you want the support and you want leadership coming from the top, but that's not always going to happen in the public sector. And we all know that, and that's not going to change. And of course, we know that much of that has to deal with people being comfortable in their lanes, right? And certainly, who your client is, right? And I believe Senator Tony Dean spoke to this about, and I sort of had one of those moments, and I thought, well, there you go, right? He talked about two clients. He talked about political, right, ministerial, and then citizens, right? And you're always going to have those challenges. Having said that, I really believe in the idea of, finding ways to make things happen. And when I was a practitioner in the federal government, I was a firm believer in, to the extent that you can do things without asking permission, you do them, right? And you prove your ideas out, right? And then you take those to those that make the decisions and make them feel comfortable about that, right? So it is a gradual process, but again, one that can be disheartening, discouraging, because there's often so much turnover and change at senior levels, right? So by the time you feel that you've, and this will sound awful, but that you've trained that person, right? And got them to a point where there's trust and confidence and comfort in what you're doing and how ultimately this will be beneficial, they tend then to move on, and then you're almost starting over again. It is about the long game, right? It is about when you're in the business of change and being an agent of change and wanting to innovate and deliver quality citizen-centric services. It's a commitment you make, right? It's a passion, right? And you just keep at it, right? So don't be dissuaded, don't be discouraged, just find ways. There are always ways, and I'll defer back to you, Lolene, but I'm sure others on the panel have thoughts on this as well.
Thank you. I'm sure we do. I've got so many questions. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions that I've received, but there's some I'm going to make sure that we squeeze in here. So this question, I'm going to throw it to Abiola and to Drew, but if anyone else wants to weigh on this one, I think it's a pretty important one to consider. And that is, how do those of us who come from specific backgrounds and experiences advocate for ourselves at work? How might we advocate for others particularly as new professionals in entry-level positions, when we might worry about feeling difficult or we're not important enough to raise concerns? I think this is a fantastic question. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Drew, I haven't called on you in a little bit, so I'm going to call on you first. What do you think on that one?
Certainly, we face this quite often at the law firm. So every year we get a brand new batch of students at each of our 6 offices, and all of them, of course, come from very different backgrounds. All of them have very different interests. And one of the things that I've found to be over the past 12 years with the firm, has been the ability of the students who continue to stay on with us as associates and eventually become partners. And the difference with those students who come into the door usually get disillusioned, disenchanted, and end up leaving shortly after their articles is the identification of within the organization, the like-minded people. So, or it's larger organizations, governmental organizations, they're living, breathing organisms. You're going to have various different components within the organization. The ones who are very proactive in terms of once they arrive at the organization, identifying individuals who share a similar interest. So presumably you're a professional entering into an organization, and if you're a lawyer getting into a law firm, you have an interest or you have a passion, and there are going to be others within that very diverse large organization who share that passion, and working on becoming very adept at identifying those individuals in advance, coming up with a creative way for having to get into a discussion with them, or identifying a common interest with them. We have people who are very brazen within the organization who will wander up to our offices and say, I couldn't help but notice that you worked on a case X number of years ago and had very interesting judgments in it. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. Would you be interested in having a lunch or just taking 10 minutes out of your day to help me discuss this? And even if it doesn't work the first time, persistence and continually trying to identify those individuals in the organization who share that similar interest. It's that passion and that connection with other people within the organization that's going to allow you it'll open doors for you, certainly. And if you found yourself in a situation where that's not the case and you're at odds with a lot of the people, or your personal views don't line up, it's only going to be a matter of time before that goes sour. So it's that passion and that shared or common identity that I think within a large organization is going to be your lifeline.
I certainly agree with Drew. I know I was talking about, finding allies and mentors who don't necessarily, look like you or have different experiences. But I certainly agree with, what Drew was saying. When I first started in the public service, here I was, I didn't really see a lot of people who look like me. And also being there as, as a newcomer, as an immigrant, a Black woman, a Muslim woman, it was hard to find spaces for me to exist. So I, vacillated towards people who maybe had some experiences, like myself. And one of the mentors I found was someone who was also a newcomer in Canada. And even though our experiences were different, he was able to share resources, and I was able to sort of find my footing. Apart from that, I think there are people who are champions of causes that maybe are dear to our hearts. I had the wonderful opportunity of working with a deputy minister, Kimberly Armstrong, for status of women then, and she was a big believer in supporting not just women, but development, and really open her doors to people. And I took that on. It was scary to be sitting in front of a DM, but she really it was a conversation. And a lot of times, as Drew was saying, if you reach out to people and say, hey, I'd love to talk to you, or can I ask you this question? People are human, like whether a deputy minister or an ADM, they are human, and they would love to sit down and really have the conversations. If you're struggling, try to also reach out to people. I think one of the best practices that really helped me as well when I first started in the government of Alberta was my then executive director. He basically said to all of us, he said, I'm interested. He came from a military background, and he said, I'm interested in not just your professional development, but also your personal development. So whatever that takes, I want you to map out a roadmap of what your next 5 years is going to look like. I had no idea, of course, but he was giving us tools and resources, whether it's books, whether it was hey, if you have to go for an hour and a half break, just to make you a better person when you come back, I'm all for it. So it was really great to find that support. So I would definitely say, look for resources. If they're not there, ask. So for me, for example, when I first came, I wanted to know, where can I pray. So I called, accommodations. I talked to my director. Where can I find this and that, resources? They sat down with me to figure out what my professional plan was and development plan was. So that was great. So, ask, don't be afraid to, maybe it's just that one person, just, that you feel comfortable approaching, ask them. There are a lot of resources now. Sometimes it might not be obvious. Like I mentioned, the employee resource groups, try to tap into that. And from there, build your networks. Also, I know not everybody's an extrovert and they're introverts as well. Find a way to step out of your comfort zone, because that's the way you grow. That's the way you learn, and that's the way you become comfortable, and also that you also become an ally in some ways or the other. So really reach out to people, reach out to resources, and try to find if your place of work doesn't already have those listed in some way, shape, or form. Advocate for it, right? Right now we have, I'm proud to say, in the government of Alberta, we are looking at diverse meditation spaces and what that looks like, and it's great conversations that wasn't there, 7 or 8 years ago.
Well, thank you. I am going to apologize to the people whose questions I did not get to, but it actually leads to a question that I think is good for all of you to answer, ideally in the chat. And one of the question was, how can people get in touch with you after today? So if you're willing to pop your LinkedIn LinkedIn link, my goodness, into the chat, that would be great. And then people can connect up with you. We had questions about social media. We had questions about how people working internationally can get into the Canadian Public Service. Trying to think of what the other questions were, but definitely please connect with people and follow up. Well, I'm just going to bring things to a close here. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I feel like we could go for another half hour, and that's just with my questions. That's not even considering the questions that are coming in at me here on the direct messages. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this session and providing your insights and your wisdom. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for providing the questions that have really helped to prompt this animated discussion. I will note this panel discussion was sponsored by the Johnson Strianwa Graduate School of Public Policy, and I really encourage everyone to take a look at some of the continuing career training opportunities that we have. We have a whole career approach, and there might be some workshops and events that might be of interest to you. We do have an EDI discussion series that goes on, and this is a free thing that you can just sit in and listen to discussions of the importance of equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigenization and decolonization in the public service. So I very much hope to see you there. And with that, I will stop talking and turn things back over to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laline Verdal, and thank you to our panelists for being authentic and for really sharing your experiences and providing those tools, those tips, and I guess those tips and tricks for the audience today. And another thank you for sharing your contact details and allowing our attendees to reach out to you after this event. Before we go, I would like to conduct a giveaway. And when I mean before we go, we're going to have another health break. Again, giving you that mental break, digest what you heard today, because it was a lot of good tips, a lot of good information. Get yourself a snack, a drink. But before you do that, we're conducting a giveaway. And the giveaway, wish I had a little drum roll. A giveaway is a book that you can see on the screen here. Two former civil servants with more than 60 years of service between them, as well as IPAC members, have written a book called How Government Really Works, and they have donated 2 copies. And so the first copy is being giving away today, and the other copy will be given away tomorrow. And drum roll, the winner is Caroline Deza. You will be reached out to offline, and we will coordinate how we can get this book to you. If you're on here, you can say hello, and we can give you an applause. So we will reach out to you. So everyone enjoy your 15-minute break, and we'll see you all back here at 3:15. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Our health break has ended, so it's back to the show here. We're going to jump right into our next session. So I would like to bring Brian Marson, an IPAC Victoria Regional Representative and former IPAC President as well. And joining him is Manjeet Bains, founder and president of Bains Strategies, with over 25 years of experience in the public sector to the virtual stage. These two individuals have a mentorship relationship for many years, and I'm excited to hear their advice on how you can grow your career. So welcome, Brian and Manjeet. Brian, show's all yours.
You're just on mute, Brian.
In the last sessions, so greetings to everybody, coast to coast in Canada. Manjeet and I are coming to you from beautiful Victoria on the traditional territory of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And we're going to piggyback on what you've already heard from our friend Tony Dean. And as he spoke, the mailman or mail person delivered this. So I get to read his book, and I encourage you to do the same. So he talked about leadership. He talked about how important it is to find excellent people who are committed to public service and are passionate about it. And we're going to talk about the leadership journey. And this comes from something that I was asked to write a few years ago in Government Executive Magazine about my advice to new professionals. And I've been a mentor all of my life and have been mentored all of my life. And what I said in the article was that in mentoring new professionals, I found that most of the ones I'd mentored had spent 6, 7 years, at least 4 years, preparing for their entry job in the public service. But they were not thinking about preparing themselves for what was coming. That is, becoming a manager and a leader. And so the theme that Manjeet and I will bring to you today is to talk about what that journey looks like and how do you prepare yourself for it to be an effective supervisor, an effective manager, an effective leader. So we'll go on to the next slide. Erin is somewhere in beautiful Ontario, and we'll go to the next slide if we can, Erin. So we're going to try to give you answers to 3 questions. First, what are the stages? What's ahead for you? What will your journey look like if you go part of the way or all the way to the top of the system? Secondly, what competencies, what knowledge, and what values do you need to have with you as you move along that journey? And the third question we'll try to answer is, how can you best build that knowledge and those competencies and to carry those values so that you will have the most successful career that you can? So we'll go to the next slide. And a lot of you, most of you probably graduated from a university. I want you to know that Manjeet and I are both new Canadians, that we both came with immigrant parents. And so when you look at us, we're like a lot of you who are younger, who might have come directly to Canada, or you came with your parents, or you were born here after your parents came. So we're part of that Canadian journey that so many of us go through. So I think I was asked by Ashley to say something about myself. So that's one thing. I came to Canada as an 11-year-old to the Greater Toronto area, Hamilton in particular. I was a working student. I went through University of BC, first person in my family to have a university degree, and then worked for CUSO, Canadian University Service Overseas, worked in Asia as a young guy, went back to school, went to Harvard, to the Kennedy School of Government, and I have to tell you, the word leadership was never mentioned. So a lot of what I actually learned, I learned from my mentors when I got into the federal government of Canada in the Treasury Board. And I think a lot of you will find the same thing, and we heard that in the previous panel. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll see what that brings. So here are 3 new professionals with their mentor in this case. And some of you know Maria Bellin, who's there. She was the head of, I think, for IPAC of the new professional group for some time. And she's now in my old spot in the Treasury Board of Canada. So we were exchanging back and forth today, and I was giving her some advice on her next career move. That's why it's so important to have mentors, as you will see, people who are ahead of you, who can give you good advice as you make your decisions going forward. So the next slide, please. So we have some questions. We want you to reflect on this. Are you a student still in university? Are you a new professional just starting out? Have you become a supervisor already, a manager, or perhaps some of you are leaders? How many years have you worked in government? Do you feel well prepared to be a good manager and leader, as Tony Dean outlined it for us? Have you received any formal management or leadership training? Do you have a mentor? And something that came up twice this morning, can you balance your career and your job with the other parts of your life? Because your career is not your life. Your life is like this, and your career is like this. Your career is part of your life, but is not your life. And please never get into the situation where you think that your career is everything in your life. I experienced that myself when I had to rebalance my life at one point along the way. And Tony Dean talked about the same thing, how he got so involved that it affected his relationships at home. So we'll mention that as we go forward now. So next slide, please. So this is the key slide that we want to show you. This is called the leadership journey, and it shows you that not for everyone will become a leader, and some of you will prefer to remain a professional because that's what you love to do. But for many of us, the system moves us, and that's what happened to Tony Dean. He became a sort of policy person in labor in the Ontario government, and then suddenly the system realized he was good, and it started to raise him up, and he moved so quickly up the system. That happened to me too. I came in as a policy person in the Treasury Board of Canada, new professional. 5 years later, I was a deputy secretary. I never applied for a job. The system just took me there. And I had to cope as best I could as I moved up the system in these new challenges. So I'm talking about, in my case, this is my own experience, and Manjeet will discuss her experience. So the first move you make is to a supervisor. So one of my mentees came in from Carleton University, and when she arrived, I met with her and I gave her a package of material on management, supervision, management, and leadership. And 6 months later, she called me in a panic, and she said, "They're giving me 4 people to supervise. I don't know how to do that. I need to meet you." And so we met and I said, did you read the material that I gave you? And she said, 6 months ago, she said, no. She said, I was just starting out and I just wanted to know how things worked and so on. And I said, what John Carson said to me, I know you're going to go up the system and you need to be prepared for that. And she didn't prepare. So I gave her a short course in supervision and she did very well. That same person, as they moved up the system, when she became a director, she was becoming a director, she called me in a panic again and said, help, they're going to make me a director and I don't know how to manage an organization. And so we talked about it and I helped her through that, including getting her to take an executive management course so that she would at least know the basics of how to manage. And also later on, she took another course when she became a leader to learn how to do strategic management as required by a leader, as Tony Dean has shown us. So at each stage of this journey, if you follow this journey, you need to acquire new skills. And whether you stay as a professional working with a team, you still need to develop the skills that will make you effective at that level. And some people decide, I don't want to go up the system. I really am happy where I am. And that's a good decision for you. You need to decide where you want to be in your career. And other people say they want to be a deputy minister or director general. In that case, you have to learn these new skill sets that make you effective as you go. One of the things that we see in the workplace surveys from all the provinces and the federal government, usually the number one thing that staff complain about is that the goals are not clear. And if you read Tony Dean's book, this is exactly what he says. When you are a leader, you need to set goals and strategies. And so if you're a new professional and you think the people 2 or 3 levels above you are not very good managers or leaders, there's a reason for that. Because they haven't developed the knowledge and skills and values in some case that make them effective managers and leaders. So that's why I always challenge new professionals, get prepared for what's coming and do it as well as you did in preparing to be a new professional. I spent 4 years, 6 years, 7 years for that first job as a professional. So do the same thing looking forward, prepare well. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that we're just asking you, where are you in that journey? And you'll see in this slide, above manager, I have put a little sign that says, slow, proceed with caution. And then I have a balance there. So why do I say that? Because I've interviewed 700 leaders and managers in the public sector in my university research. And a lot of them tell me, I was a happy professional and then I'm an unhappy manager and leader. It's not the right thing for me. And I can't balance my life, as Tony said. You know, I have young kids, I have a wife, I have elderly parents, and I have to balance my life. And when I'm a manager, it's just too much. And it's a 24/7 proposition. So you have to think carefully about what's right for you. And it may be that if you have young children, that's a time not to go up the ladder. It may be a time just to enjoy the job you're in so that you can pick up the kids and you can spend time at home and so on. So that's why the caution sign is there, because career is not life. And you can be very successful and be an unhappy public servant. So as Plato said, know yourself. What's important to me in my life? How much of my life do I want to give to my career? And therefore, where do I want to be in the public service? That makes me happy, fulfilled, and allows me to do the other things in my life. So my wife is a public servant and she loves dance. and she's very involved in our church and some other things. So she, right now, and we have a young son, so she wants a job that she can return home at 5 o'clock and leave that aside and do the other things that are important in her life. So think about that for you. What do you need in your life to have a balanced life where your career is not overwhelming everything else, but it's a career in the public service where you get a lot of fulfillment, but you can also balance your life. So next slide, please. So this is just a formalization of what you saw here, what you saw in the previous slide. And we have this, by the way, we're going to give you a lot of material as an annex. And the reason we did that is we don't have time to to really go into detail. So we've given you material that will be given to you as part of the presentation, which will allow you to reflect on your journey and how to prepare for it. So we've given you a lot of resource material in the PowerPoint that we won't cover in the presentation. So the next slide, please. So I've done a lot of research. As Tony Dean says in his book, there's almost no research done on leadership in the public sector. And that's true. So when I was the vice president of the Canada School of Public Service, I began doing this research to find out what makes for an effective leader in the public sector. And what came back out of that research, people said three things. Leaders set goals and purpose. What are we here to do? And if you read Tony Dean's book, you'll see he says that's a really important function of a leader. Secondly, you have to make an environment where people love to come to work and really want to commit to achieve the goals of the organization, and they have fun doing it. And thirdly, you get results. And so you have to give people an incentive, you have to monitor, you have to measure, you have to make sure the organization's getting results. Well, in these three areas, for the purpose area of leadership, you need visioning skills, scanning skills, strategic planning, setting clear goals, which is one of the big missing things in the public sector in many organizations, according to the staff. Change management skills. We heard about that from Tony Dean this morning. And then on the people side, communication and especially listening skills. And values like honesty and integrity. When I ask people what's the most important attribute of an effective public service leader, you know what they tell me? Honesty and integrity. We never talk in the leadership literature, they almost never talk about values. The values are so important to being an effective manager and an effective leader. And then, of course, inspiring and motivating staff and getting results. So I think we're on my last slide, next one. So these are some of the skills. And then the next question we were trying to answer for you is, how do I get those skills? How do I get that knowledge? And what came out of my research and interviewing all of these leaders and managers was they said the most effective way of learning is actually experiential. It's not taking a course. Yes, that can be helpful. But what they tell me is my number one learning came from on-the-job experience, including observing bosses and other leaders, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and especially the good, because I want to learn from them. That's my role model. That's who I want to be. That's who I want to become. And then mentors and coaches. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. And special assignments. We heard in the last panel, stretch assignments outside of my comfort zone. Our colleague from Edmonton, that these are the ways that I grew. Scary, but that's how I grew. So what we get from the research, practical research, is the people who are effective leaders in the public sector tell us that experiential learning is very important. Yes, you can take classroom learning, but experiential learning is much more powerful. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Manjeet. And Manjeet has been through an amazing journey since I first met her many years ago. And now we're colleagues and we learn from each other. So Manjeet, over to you.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay? Thanks for the opportunity to join with you to share a little bit about my journey and to connect some of the dots with the information that you've provided as well. So hello to everybody. I'm going to share a little bit of general information about me, and then I'm going to go through these 4 steps that Brian referred to as well. So when I started off my career after I graduated from high school, I actually wanted to be a PE teacher. And so I'm going to take you to the journey to show you where I've ended up, and it was not a PE teacher. Anyways, I started off coming to Camosun College in Victoria, taking some business program courses, and then started in retail and started as a sales clerk, and worked my way up pretty quickly into an assistant manager role and into a manager role. And then after a couple of years in that journey, I realized that it wasn't quite enough, but I didn't know what was going to be enough, but I knew that I wanted to try something a little bit different. So along my way, I decided that I wanted to work in the provincial government. It was the largest employer here in Victoria and in British Columbia. And so I thought it was probably a very good place to start. I started applying for jobs within the provincial government. And I think I spent months of throwing in my resume, and I didn't get anybody phoning me back for an interview. So I talked to a couple of people in my sort of community, and one person recommended that I volunteer. And I thought, what does that even mean? What does volunteering mean? And how does that connect to me advancing my career? But I listened. And so in July of 1987, I phoned the United Way and I said, I'd love to volunteer. They said, fabulous. We are starting our annual campaign in August. We'd love for you to join our wine and cheese party in August of 1987. And of course, I was only 23. I didn't know what that actually meant. I didn't know what actually happened at a wine and cheese party, and I didn't know what you did to volunteer either. But anyways, I listened to the advice. I showed up at the wine and cheese party at Harbour Towers in Victoria. I slowly walked in. I was nervous as heck and didn't know what to do, and found the courage to walk up to this individual who was sitting all by himself. I walked closer to him. He looked up at me and thought, what is a 23-year-old doing at a wine and cheese party? And he actually asked me, he said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm actually not sure, but somebody suggested I volunteer. But what I really want to do is work in the provincial government. And somebody suggested that I might meet a bunch of people here. He was a bit taken back that I was being quite candid, considering this was a wine and cheese party and it was about fundraising and raising money for the community. And he says, okay, well, come on up. He stood up, and I thought he was actually going to walk away from me, but he actually said, follow me, walked me down a hallway, walked me up to this tall, slim, handsome, well-dressed gentleman, and introduced me to his boss and said, this is Manjeet Bains. She's here because she wants to work in government and wants to meet some people. And then he walked away. This individual he introduced me to basically asked me a couple of questions about myself. And then he proceeded to hand me his business card. And he said, give me a call. I'll make you a cup of tea. I thought, this is like a pretty senior provincial government employee, and he's handing me his business card and is promising to make me tea. And I said, okay, thank you. And I actually stuck around for a little bit, and then I left. And for weeks on end, I kept pulling that business card up and I didn't know what to do with it. And eventually I started calling it, but got scared every time and hung up when somebody answered the phone. And that happened a couple of times until I got the courage to actually stay on the line. And when his executive assistant answered, I think the third or fourth time, I proceeded to say, here's what happened. I met this individual. He's encouraged me to call you, set up an appointment, and he'll make me team. I got that appointment set up. I arrived in his office, and it was a huge office. He got up, he introduced himself again, welcomed me, got up, actually started boiling water and made me a cup of tea. His name is Brian Morrison. So Brian has been my mentor since 1987, and I have been incredibly grateful for him along the way. While he never once got me a particular job, and I want to reinforce that because we make the mistake along the way that sometimes our mentors are the individuals who get us the jobs. He actually played an incredible role throughout my journey, and I'll speak about that each step of the way here. About the biggest thing he did is he opened doors that I didn't even know existed or needed to be opened. So I'll share a little bit about that mentor role as I proceed in my journey here. So if we could move to the next slide, that'd be great. So as at the professional level, if we could move to the next slide, that'd be awesome. At the professional level, Brian talked about being a subject matter expert. We all go to school. We learn a lot of academics. We learn a lot about our subject matter area of expertise. And so I did the same. I arrived at Camosun College. I did 2 business diplomas. I became a retail manager and thought that I had enough experience to do whatever I wanted to do, only to find out that it wasn't what I wanted to do at the time. So I started meeting Brian for coffee and tea, and he encouraged me to contact people. And each step along the way, as I phoned people in the public service, they were very open, they were very welcoming, and were always available to meet with me along the way. That allowed me to open one door, and that was to get into the public service at a very junior level. My very first job after being a manager of a retail clothing store in the public service was to be a courier and a file clerk. So I made that transition knowing that it was the right transition for me to make, and started in the accounts payable area. And worked my way through at the first level under professional, being accounts payable clerk, a financial officer, helping to develop financial policy, implementing financial systems, doing a lot of training, and those sorts of things along the way. So at the professional level, I was expanding my experience. I was expanding my network. I was continuing to do some more education, but more importantly, I was having a lot of fun along the way. And then the breakthrough came, and I was actually, a few years later, I was offered a job as a supervisor that led me to the court services branch in the Ministry of Attorney General, where I was able to lead a group of people. Was I ready for that supervisor role? Absolutely not. Did I know what supervisor actually meant? No, I did not. But what I had done along my professional journey was watch and observe my supervisors. And as Brian mentioned, the good, the bad, the ugly, you really observe through your experience the pros of being a supervisor, really good experiences with really great leaders. And then along the way, you do learn how not to do things as well. But as a supervisor in the court services branch, I realized that I was now going to become a team lead of groups of people. I had to be very careful not to dive deeply in the subject matter expert area. And I was now overseeing the doing. I was no longer doing the doing myself. So I did develop some more supervisory skills through training. I did go and meet with people. I did go take some training as well. And I've continued to broaden my experience along the way. So things at the supervisory level, I realized, as Brian just said, I was not ready. I was not prepared. So if I can leave that with you, reinforce what Brian said, start your journey early, start preparing yourself early in terms of learning some of the competencies and the skills that might be required of you. I also learned that being a supervisor is a lot of hard work, but I loved working in teams. And I learned that success is fun along the way. So that kept me going into the manager role, where now my portfolio began to expand and broaden. And I moved into a director role, now responsible for a couple of programs, not only locally in Victoria, but across 35 offices across the province as well, within a couple of areas that I was working with in the court services branch, in the criminal justice branch, in the finance area as well. I was starting to be given some stretch assignments outside of my comfort zone. But what I started learning there was that it was very important to treat people the way you want to be treated. You needed to start stepping back from the details. You needed to keep broadening your experience. But what I was learning was that my knowledge level was starting to decrease at the doing level. And that was actually okay, because you had people who were a part of your team that you were going to start delegating to and empowering them to actually get the work done. And your job was now to oversee that and to break down barriers so they could actually get this job done along the way there. But the most critical part here, as I moved into a manager director role, was I was also managing my personal life. I got married, I had 2 kids, and it was not easy juggling a household, 2 young kids, a husband, a family, and you were continuing to move up the ladder as a manager and as a director. So I made some mistakes along the way, and I realized after our second child was born that I had to make a change in my career, because at that time I was still traveling a lot around the province. And I realized I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to be at home, and I wanted to be at home for dinner every night as well, and to be taking my kids to school and so forth. So I actually made a sideways step. Instead of going upwards, I made a sideways step and took a role that didn't require me to supervise people, but I was actually still responsible for a large program area. And I became responsible for a stretch assignment that included creating an organization that would provide consumer services called Consumer Protection BC outside of government. And after doing that for 2 years, I was offered the role of vice president of Consumer Protection BC, a major program area, provincial in nature, having sort of tentacles nationally as well. But it was a job that was completely outside my comfort zone. So right from being professional, supervisor, and manager, I was always in support roles in terms of providing budget, HR, information technology, and facilities advice. And as the vice president, I was being offered a job that I would never have applied for when I looked at the job profile. But the president of the organization believed in me and said, I know that you can do it. And so now I was going to be in a role that I was going to be responsible for media spokesperson. I was going to be responsible for consumer relations, stakeholder relations, government relations, developing policy and legislation. But I did it. I went outside my comfort zone and had that time of my life in a job that I probably would never have applied for, but a person believed in me. And along that way, I kept in touch with my mentor every step along the way. There were times where it was very difficult. I didn't know what to do. I was having a tough time. I was getting stuck, but I phoned up Brian each time, always met with me. And he had confidence in me. He had confidence in me way before I had confidence in myself. He was believing in me as a senior leader before I knew that I was going to become a senior leader down the pipeline. And he was just a motivator. He inspired me and kind of kept me and steered me sort of along my journey here. So Brian, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there and allow us maybe to go on to sort of the next slide, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Aaron, please, if you can do that for us. I've lost my screen. So let me then pick up the questions here. So Manjeet, so when you look back on this amazing journey that you've been through, what were for you the most important ways that you learned to supervise, manage, and lead?
That's actually a really good question that comes up quite a lot from people that are going through their journey here. And I think, again, what happens is that we do take subject matter experts in their professional step along their journey, and we quickly move them into supervisors and managers or leaders of people. So when I started going through that journey, the most important things that I started to do was I started talking to my supervisor or supervisors I had had in the past. I started taking some additional training, very focused training, how to lead people, how to inspire people, how to manage performance, how to deal with difficult conversations or performance issues or conflict or those kinds of things. So broadening my train experience, but also broadening my toolkit along the way. And just asking supervisors around the do's and don'ts. But another area that I learned the most was making mistakes. We are going to make mistakes along the way, and you sure as heck learn not to make those same mistakes again. But every once in a while, you might actually do that as well.
So what lessons did you learn? And let's focus on what advice you would give to the people who are listening, Manjeet, looking back in your career. What advice would you give to new professionals who are just starting out on the journey that you've described?
Absolutely. I'll reinforce two things that I think have been coming up along the way here. One is building relationships is absolutely significant as you go through your journey. And how you build that is by broadening and connecting back with your network. And you can build your network in many different ways as well. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't know what network was. I didn't know what mentor was until somebody said, go volunteer. So some people will ask, well, how do you go get a mentor? Well, a mentor's not going to land on a silver platter for you. And my recommendation to students when I teach at Camosun College, Introduction to Management, is I always encourage people to go volunteer. Those mentors are in your community. Those mentors are also public service employees who are giving back to the community. So I would encourage you to go volunteer, build your network, work on your relationships along the way.
So let's go to the next slide, Erin, which I think is going to be the summary of our advice to new professionals. So number one is, you've heard from us, we think you should prepare well for the supervisory, management, and leadership roles that may come your way. And they may come a lot faster than you think, as it did for me, as it did for Tony Dean, as it did for Manjeet, and as it did for a lot of my mentees, who then sort of panicked and needed immediate advice, emergency advice, because it came so much faster than they thought. Secondly, public service values. We don't hear a lot of talk about that in the leadership literature, but in the public sector, values are so important. And the ones that come out in my interviews with leaders are honesty, integrity, respect, caring for people, and then openness and transparency. So don't forget the values, because people who work for you, they want to see those values in the people above them. And so think about how you demonstrate those values in your work. And then thirdly, our recommendation is use both experiential learning and formal learning to gain the knowledge and the competencies that you need. And we also recommend you really try to find some good mentors. And as Manjeet said, they're not going to come on a silver platter. You're going to have to look for them. But what we found, both of us, is, and Tony Dean as well, is that most really good leaders are happy to serve as a mentor. And if you ask them, 9 times out of 10, people will say, sure, I'm glad to do that. So we, on item 3, the appendix that we are going to give you is sort of post seminar, where you can ask yourself, what are the competencies and knowledge that you need to move the next step in your journey? And then how are you going to get that knowledge and those competencies? And what are the most powerful ways that I can get prepared for the rest of my journey? So next slide, please. I think we're on to the question of mentorship. So what kind of mentors? So people think it's kind of a formal thing, but I think what we both have experienced is observing bosses and other leaders, especially the ones that you want to emulate. You actively observe how they do that. And that's what I did in the federal system. I picked out 2 or 3 really amazing leaders, and I watched how they performed and how they did things. I didn't have to talk to them. I just saw what they did and I tried to emulate that. The second thing is, I don't know if you like M&Ms. My son loves M&Ms, but I just put that in there to get you to think that it's not just one mentor, that find multiple mentors if you can, M&Ms. Find mentors that are a little bit ahead of you, maybe 3 or 5 years ahead of you, or just up a level. And then people who are where you want to go, maybe a much higher level, executive level. So think of multiple mentors, and then choose good role models, people who you would like to pattern your career after, or your leadership style or your management style. So look for public service role models, like Tony Dean. I was just blown away by what he had to say. I've known him for a long time, and I thought the wisdom that he was giving us today was just extraordinary. And I'd like to go back and hear that again, his whole presentation. So then we move on to questions, I think, in the next slide, Aaron, please. We want to hear from you. And I think, Ashley, are you going to moderate this, or Aaron?
Perfect.
Somebody's going to give
right
us the
here.
questions?
I'm right here. Perfect timing. We have only one time for one question from the audience, and then we have to move forward to our next session. But this was very informative. So one of the questions someone has put on the chat feature is, how are you able to balance culture and work? Manjeet.
That's a very good question. I think it's definitely becoming harder and harder for a lot of leaders, in that you are trying to balance all kinds of things in terms of your own personal sort of well-being, your professional sort of journey, your mental state in this current sort of world where you're leading a whole bunch of supervisors. So balancing your professional and your culture is not easy, and it makes you do have to take the time, and you have to reflect on it and think a lot about what is actually very, very important to you. Set some goals for yourself, and to make sure that you're getting some advice along the way of other people who are finding those challenges as well. But it does take a little bit of planning, and I would encourage you to do it in a more sort of organized and kind of cohesive kind of way. And would love to see if Brian might have anything to add to that.
Yes, I went through this myself. I think I mentioned this. When I was 37 years old, I was the youngest deputy secretary in the federal government. And people thought, oh, wow, you're going to be a deputy, you know, career success, amazing. And I had been through a divorce, and I was spending all my time at work, and I wasn't happy. So I had to ask myself, how are you going to rebalance your life? And so I decided to move back to British Columbia, and became the Controller General of British Columbia. I had a wonderful experience there. My mom and dad were elderly and were getting health issues, and I could be there for them. And I had a secretary who was very forward in her views, and she said to me, Brian, if you spend as much time organizing your personal and social life as you do your career life, you're going to be a much happier guy. So, and that was true. It was good advice. So I got involved in United Way, which is how I met Manjeet. I started teaching at the university because I love to teach. I wrote a couple of books. I got involved in my church. So I had a balanced life, and I was a happy person. I had a good career, but I was a much happier person than I had been a year earlier, when I seemed like a very successful guy, but it wasn't enough. That's why I say career is not life. You have to decide for yourself where that balance is. And that will change at different points in your life, especially as Manjeet said, you're handling kids and a young family. That's probably not a time to have a stretch job. You want a job that you can handle. And when the kids get into school, then maybe you resume your path upwards.
Thank you both for answering that question. It's very important to identify your values in a point of time, because those values will change along your career journey. We're going to push the envelope a little bit and ask one more question before we wrap up to our final session of the day. So a huge flood of questions coming my way. So I'm going to pick one random. And one person has asked, what helped you learn how to delegate? How did you find a balance to ensure you have enough of an in-depth understanding of the work while letting go of the work? And a lot of our attendees today are moving through their career and entering a more supervisory role and letting go of the doing. Manjeet, Brian?
I would love to start off with that one. Just as I was speaking, sort of going up that ladder, if you do not learn how to delegate, you will drown. I know that for sure. And so it is a very good question. And there's lots of different sort of courses you can take, tips you can take, a lot of articles you can read around that. But I think the first thing is to have really good awareness around that you must be able to delegate. And you have to start letting go of the details. You do have to start, delegating a lot more. And how you do that through your leadership journey is, as Brian mentioned earlier, is as you move, is our role becomes one of setting the strategy, setting the direction, engaging and collaborating with all the employees and stakeholders and clients, whoever you need to help set the direction. Once people get involved in that and they believe it, it's amazing how they jump on the bus and start helping you move that bus and journey and take on the responsibilities in your role as a supervisor. It almost becomes really easy to delegate because people start taking it on as their responsibility and authority and accountability. So you help set the direction, you build your teams, you build trust. They will jump on the bus with you and start doing the doing. Your job becomes helping to remove those barriers, and your job becomes basically to help those people to do the doing as opposed to doing the doing yourself.
So this is an iPhone, and I was the first person in Canada to own one of these on July 1st, 2007. And this is a blessing and a curse. The curse part is that it allows managers and leaders to continue to do the work rather than to delegate the work, because it's so easy to send text messages back and forth to people who are at the front line. So after I got my iPhone, I sort of put it aside for quite a while, because as a manager leader, I needed to think and I needed to set strategy for the organization. And I was involved in a transactional iPhone BlackBerry world. And so I learned to set that aside, to use it for certain things, but to make sure I had time to do the strategic side of leadership and management. The other thing and we heard this from Tony Dean about when he became a supervisor and manager, he had to learn to delegate. But I'll give you one other nugget that has gone with my whole career. My most important mentor told me, Brian, when you're a manager, you take the time to get the best people. Take the time, because if you can get 3 or 4 or 5 really outstanding people, you can change the world. And so I've done that all my life. When I get into a new position, I try to put together a team of really outstanding people. I delegate and I let them run with it. And if they need help, let me know, but I'm not going to micromanage them. I'm going to count on them to deliver the goods. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Manjeet. And for everyone, Brian's and Manjeet's presentation will be shared after today's event. I'm going to go forward to the next session that we have for today. And the next session is titled Federal Election. Where does public administration fit? So this session is going to discuss the impact of the Canadian federal election results to the future of public administration and public service across all levels of government and sectors. So today's session will be moderated by David Arbuckle, the Executive Director of the Association of Municipal Managers, Clerks, and Treasurers of Ontario. David has held many senior management roles with both the town of Caledon and the region of Peel. Before joining the municipal sector, David served as Chief of Staff to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, where he helped lead several key municipal issues, including the Provincial Municipal Fiscal and Service Delivery Review and the new affordable housing investments. So I'd like to welcome David to the virtual stage, where he will lead us in this session.
Great. Thank you very much, Ashley. And thank you so much to IPAC for allowing me to be part of today's discussion. My name is Dave Arbuckle, and I am the Executive Director for AMCTO. Those unfamiliar with our organization, we are Ontario's largest municipal professional organization, specializing in education, professional development, and advocacy for over 2,000 municipal leaders. This panel on the potential implications of the federal election on the public service will undoubtedly provide you with valuable insights into our current environment and really future decision making. We'll first take a look at gaining an understanding of the public's reaction to the recent federal election, and then our speakers will provide some expert perspectives on the political and public service environments in Ottawa and what they might mean for public policy in our country. And again, obviously, if time will allow, our speakers will be pleased to take some questions at the end of today's session. So let's kick off and let me introduce Frank Graves. Mr. Graves is one of Canada's leading public opinion, social policy, and public policy experts, as well as being one of its leading applied social researchers. In 1980, he founded Ecos Research Associates, Inc., an applied social and economic research firm. Under the leadership of Mr. Graves, Ecos has earned a reputation for creative and rigorous research in the areas of public policy, social policy, and program evaluation, and as a leader in innovative survey techniques and methodologies. During his career, he has directed hundreds of large-scale studies of Canadian attitudes to a vast array of issues. His analysis and advice has been sought by senior decision makers in both the private and public sectors. Mr. Graves is a fellow of the Canadian Research Insights Council, as well as an honorary fellow with the Calgary School of Public Policy, and sits on the advisory board for the Sprott School of Business. Mr. Graves is an adjunct research professor with the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University in Ottawa. And Mr. Graves is also a member of the Federal Vaccine Confidence Task Force group and is a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. That's an awfully long introduction, particularly since I have so many slides to share with you in such a short period of time. I'll try and move briskly, but I want to give you a sense. We had this election which came along in the midst of a once-in-a-lifetime collision of economic and health risks, the likes of which the country hasn't seen before. And connecting the election and its outcomes and the future, we really have to look at that background. So I want to give you a bit of a sense of what the election seemed to be about, how the public were judging the various alternatives in front of them, and what the results mean in terms of the future, but in particular, what kind of opportunities and pressures and threats this might provide for public service in Canada. Because I think that the issue of public service and trust in government is one of the core sources of polarization we saw in the election. So let me just go through a few slides. If I could go to the... So we've been asking people a long time what they think after a lot of these results today are based on a fairly extensive exit poll that we did for a week after the election to try and figure out what was going on. Only 1 in 5 Canadians said they thought the election was something that satisfied them. Even amongst Liberals, who were the ones that saw their party being successful, less than half were satisfied. We've seen on a number of key barometers, including trust in government, approval of national direction, that the public are in a relatively sour mood. This is witnessed as what we saw as what we might call a false dawn in the late spring, where 87% of Canadians thought the worst of the pandemic was over. The Liberal fortunes were soaring as they saw the opportunity to gather a majority government. But unfortunately for them and for the country, the fourth wave wreaked a lot of havoc and continues to do so. And so the incidence, those who thought the worst was over, declined precipitously, as did the Liberals' fortunes. If I could just go to the next slide. So I'm going to try and give you the election in a nutshell, and there's really 5 moments to the election. People will say it was more complicated and there was a lot of big issues. Many of those didn't get discussed. The big, I'll talk first about the pre-campaign period. Just as we were approaching Canada Day, I think the Liberals' sense of an opportunity for majority was very high, as was their vote intention numbers. And that was buoyed by real enthusiasm about a vaccine rollout, which had been dramatically better than expected, and a belief that the worst was behind it. As that started fraying, so did the Liberal fortune. So we run into this election when the Rich drop. The Liberals find themselves basically in a tie with the Conservatives. Second moment, the Conservatives launch a newly Aaron O'Toole 2.0, who's now reprising Bill Davis rather than Donald Trump, a moderate platform, which gains initial favor from an electorate that kind of going, scratching their head. This wasn't really what we expected, but that looked really good. So we go up until Labor Day. All of a sudden, the Conservatives have opened up a fairly significant lead, and the flummoxed Liberals are wondering what's going on. The dreams of a majority are vanished, and they may well find themselves sitting not only on the opposition side, but in the majority government. However, the next moment saw that the Conservatives now were faced to dealing with the contradictions between this newly centrified Conservative Party and a lot of people in the party and a lot of past policy positions which didn't line up, and most notably positions on assault weapons and guns, and then the positions on vaccines. Those started causing real problems to the Conservatives. They lost some of the gains they'd made from blue Liberals in Ontario and BC, but it also was buoying the People's Party, who'd gone from 1.5% in the last election to as high as 10 or 11 points. Okay, so then a little side story, a fourth moment happened after the national debate. You'll see, and I'll look at the numbers later, that a very large number of Bloc Québécois supporters whose fortunes were flagging before that saw their fortunes reversed and galvanized, and that was a major force as well. Then in the final stages, we saw the People's Party voters actually staying home or returning to the Conservative fold for fear of electing a Justin Trudeau government, so that's it. That's the election in a nutshell. So no real debate about climate change, about the massive amount of public debt that we've accumulated, how to deal with some of the problems that have been laid bare by the pandemic in terms of social class, race, hyper-concentration of wealth at the top. Climate change is a long list of formidable challenges, none of which really got discussed. Next slide. So here you can see the level of, it was not, Hosanna's great election. What the worst scores in terms of satisfaction. If I go to the next slide, you can see that this great number that were dissatisfied kind of transcends, goes across all the parties. Look at how unhappy. Only 2% of People's Party voters were happy with this, which were probably people who weren't paying attention to to the survey. Next question. Next slide, sorry. Now, I want to go back and look at something which asks people, do they trust the government in Ottawa and Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? You can look back in the solid days of the 60s and 70s. Yeah, everybody thought government did things on their behalf, went right behind closed doors, but basically it all worked. That went down in lockstep in both countries, as Canada and the United States, and reached a new nadir as this century opened up. Went even further. This is polling we did in the United States just in the lead up to the American election, an all-time low. As the Americans were going, wow, we really didn't handle this pandemic very well. Meanwhile, Canada, initially there was a huge jump, a 30-year high jump in trust in government, which kind of moved around uncertainly, and now that's coming down as well. Why is trust so important? For a whole range of things. But I can tell you that of those who have vaccinated in the country, the levels of trust are exceptionally high. Of those who haven't, it's zero. Next question. So there was an appearance that this was a relatively smooth, placid election, not much happened. There was actually all kinds of movement under the surface. I think I've gone through this and I want to save some time for questions and so forth, but I will point out that the gambit by the Conservatives to move to a more center and moderate position worked initially attracting some, dissatisfied Liberal voters who were concerned about public finances, didn't like Mr. Trudeau much anymore, wondering why we're having an election. But then the kind of reality of this dramatic contradiction within the Conservative constituency really began hurting Mr. O'Toole on both the left and the right. Next slide, please. So the People's Party saw a lot of their votes collapsing. Interestingly, the group is defined by institutional mistrust, which means they're difficult to get in surveys. We did go to extra efforts to get them. In the American election, the estimates of Trump support were underestimated by 3 points because they didn't have these people. In our case, we overestimated the People's Party support because they were going to pick them, but they figured I'm not going to get any power, I'm not going to get an MP, and I'm going to elect Justin Trudeau. So they basically collapsing down to 5 points. But they're all still, the forces are all still circling out there. Next slide, please. You can see, I won't go through this in any depth, but there's some interesting things. For example, you can see when did people make up their final decision. You can see the huge plurality of Bloc Québécois voters after the national debate going, I think I'm going to vote for for the Bloc, who had been struggling at that point. Also notable is just how few people decided they were going to vote for the People's Party on election day or the final weekend, which showed that their support was unraveling under the force of worries of electing Justin Trudeau. So there's more detail, but I'm not going to go into it right now. Next slide, please. You can see that this repositioning to the center, it worked. A plurality of people who actually voted for the Conservatives said, yeah, I kind of like that, but it wasn't overwhelming. But if you look at, say, the People's Party, no, only 8% said they liked this new, more centrist Aaron O'Toole, and it didn't really work much across the spectrum. So you see, it was effective initially, but kind of unraveled as time went on. Next slide, please. I'm going to conclude by just looking at some of the really big issues that are out there, which didn't get talked about in the election, interestingly, which are going to put enormous challenges on governments at all levels. But as we see these top issues, which we've tracked for many years, the ones that are dominating the list, it's really quite instructive. It's a long list of 20 items, but you can see the first 5 of these items, and you could argue maybe environment as well, and climate change, are dealing with what we might call human capital or social issues. Healthcare dominating overwhelmingly. A growing belief that you shouldn't be in a regional lottery in Canada, which says if you're living in one province, you may have literally 6 times the fatality rate that's going on in another province. What are we supposed to have a Canada Health Act? Jobs and growth is very important. There's a lot of economic anxiety, also concerns about inflation, and this is fueling a pretty sour mood. I think it's perhaps a little bit exaggerated. You can see that the terrible performance, Canada really did a horrible job in long-term care. People want that fixed. Mental health is really, really up there. This is an unprecedented position. We have found that throughout this pandemic, the instance of people exhibiting anxiety and stress, and we've been tracking it daily. Remember, when we first asked people in March of 2020 when they thought it would be over, 66% said in 6 months. Here we are 20 months later, they're now saying 2 years or more. Then we see other big issues, but I'll go to the next slide, and you can see that on this long list, the things like deficit has actually been going down, which is really instructive. It's very, very important for some voters out there, but most of the voters, it's not. You can look at this at some other time, because I've already probably taken my 10 minutes and a little more. Just a few conclusions. Next slide. Oh, I was going to tell you about these things. This question is an index which measures authoritarian populism. It comes from a long tradition back to a guy named Theodor Adorno, who tried to figure out what went on in Europe with the rise of fascism, but it predicted that very well. It's been dusted off because it predicted Brexit and Trump extremely well. And look at how well it predicts what's going on in Canada. We should be concerned about this. These ask questions nothing about your political preference. They ask questions about preference for child rearing. For example, when I'm raising my child, should I stress obedience or creativity? Putting these 4 questions together, you can create those with an authoritarian outlook, which is, you can see the dramatic difference. Is only 2% of those with the most ordered outlook voted Liberal versus 69% for Conservative. And the pyramids and little vortexes work. So you can see that this open order division is already kind of transplanted the traditional left-right debate and axis for the future. And this is really going to be at the heart of the contest for the future. Final slide. No, it's not it. I'm going to skip that. We're going to go right to the concluding point. Okay, so we have a country, I'll just go back one. So we have a country that's gripped with a lot of anxiety about the pandemic. That's now loosening its grip. Canadians now once again think that the vaccinations are now, we're turning the corner, we're seeing the thing in the rear view mirror, but that has not produced an uplift in terms of economic outlook. We're seeing some recovery of confidence in the federal government. We're seeing stress dropping a bit. So I think we could be on the verge of something being much better soon. But we don't see that sense that the pandemic is receding, having any halo effect on expectations of returning to normalcy. That's now seen as a vanishing horizon in the distant future. The greatest number ever say we're never going to see a return to normalcy. And then my final point, we are now living in a country which is fragmented and polarized in ways that it hasn't been before. Finding a consensus position to move forward is virtually impossible, yet we must move forward. So this is going to produce enormous challenges on public service. And that's enough. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Frank. A lot to unpack there for sure. And I'm sure we're going to circle back to much of that information as we go along. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Roy Cullen. So born in Montreal, Roy earned his BA in Business Administration and a Master's in Public Administration. He qualified as a Canadian Chartered Accountant in 1972. Initially elected to the House of Commons in a by-election in 1996, he was re-elected in 1997, 2000, 2004, and in the 2006 general election. He retired from the Canadian House of Commons in 2008. As a member of the Chrétien and Martin governments, Mr. Cullen served a multitude of essential roles, including the chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance and to the Deputy Prime Minister, and as the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. In 2006, he was sworn in as a member of the Queen's Privy Council of Canada. During his parliamentary career, Mr. Cullen was instrumental in the stewardship of important legislation, including Bill C-212, an act respecting user fees, as well as helping in the design and implementation of Canada's anti-money laundering regime. Mr. Cullen also has a administrative background as well, where he served as Assistant Deputy Minister of the then Ministry of Forests in British Columbia. A two-time author, in 2008, Mr. Cullen completed a book, The Poverty of Corrupt Nations, in which he examines the relationship between corrupt leaders and poverty, and how, as a result of the misappropriation of public assets by elected and senior officials, millions of citizens around the world are being deprived of the basic human right of the chance to move out of the ranks of the poor. He offers a 20-point plan as a way of attacking these vexing problems. In his second book, Beyond Question Period, or What Really Goes On in Ottawa, which was published in 2011, he chronicles the life of an MP in Ottawa beyond the rhetoric of the cut and thrust of Question Period. I will turn it over to Mr. Cullen.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction, and thank you to IPAC for this opportunity. to be here today with you. I also like to thank my good friend Brian Marson for encouraging me to reconnect with IPAC. So you should have the, do you have the PowerPoint on the screen?
We can see it, yes, it's just not at full screen.
Okay, how do I do that?
If you hit the small projector on the bottom beside the view, down at the bottom of your screen, that'll go to
Okay.
full screen.
Okay,
So it's right beside the minus sign on your bottom.
okay, right. Alrighty, so we'll go to the second slide now. How do I do that? These systems are all a bit different.
Do you want me to throw it up quickly? I can do that.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm having this problem, but with this full screen share, I can't how to advance the slide.
You can just click enter, Roy, on your pad. Things should go.
Oh,
Yeah, there you
okay.
go. Perfect.
Okay, so we had this election, as Frank's talked about very eloquently, September 21st, which people wondered why we were having it. And I think one thing that gets lost in the shuffle is that in a minority government, I had the great honor to serve in two very big majorities with Mr. Chrétien, and a smaller minority with Mr. Chrétien, and then a minority government with Mr. Paul Martin, is that in a minority government, of course, you have an agenda and a policy program, but to get your program through, you have to work with other parties, which can be a good thing as well, but it inhibits your ability to move forward in the way you'd like to. And of course, the Mr. Justin Trudeau's government had to work with mostly the NDP. And as it turns out, because the results were almost a mirror image in this last election, looks like that's happening again. So it inhibits your style a bit, but Canadians obviously wanted this type of situation. So here we are. It's interesting that Mr. Trudeau promised to end first past the post election campaigns. And of course, he was criticized heavily for not moving on that agenda. But if you look at the results of this election just passed, the Conservative Party actually won a small, a bigger share of the popular vote. And so I think it would be difficult for them perhaps to form some kind of cooperation or coalition with other parties. The NDP is the obvious one, but I don't think the chemistry there is very good. But it sort of begs the question, are we moving back again to proportional representation, that debate, and how would the parties see it in a new light? It may never surface again because, of course, the Liberal Party, everybody knows that they would like a ranked balloting system if they're going to move away from first past the post, but that would be clearly to the benefit of the Liberal Party. So Mr. Trudeau can't be seen as advancing that, it's be seen as self-serving. So the NDP is traditionally proportional representation, and Conservatives are traditionally first past the post. I think that the Conservative Party would have been very disappointed with the results they achieved in Ontario and in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area. They were looking for some gains there. What will happen to Mr. O'Toole? Anyone's guess. Time will tell, but he's had some criticism for the way he handled the election campaign, and Frank touched on some of that. In terms of the Liberal Party, I'm sure that Mr. Trudeau will pay a bit of a price for calling this election. When will he retire? Who knows? But when he does, I think there's a pretty good bevy of people that are available to fight it out for the leadership, including, of course, Chrystia Freeland, Mr. Champagne, Anita Anand, and many others, if they want the job. And another one that's sort of a sleeper or an outlier would be Mark Carney. I think he has some political ambitions. And Brian and Manji talked about values and the importance. If anyone wants a tough read, but a very good read, they could read Mark Carney's book called Values and talk about visionary. And I think he's got some great ideas. So diversity. This election, there were 3 more female MPs elected. We're at now 30.4%, which is better than some, but worse than others. The leader in the world is Rwanda. Their parliament has 61.3% women, followed by Cuba at 53.2%, and then Bolivia and Mexico. But so some work to do there. Of course, Mr. Trudeau lost 4 female cabinet ministers, 3 because they lost their seat, and 1 because Minister McKenna decided not to run. But I think he's found some really capable women to replace them. There were gains in terms of visible minorities throughout. And I think, well, it's obvious Mr. Trudeau met his commitment to gender balance the cabinet. I won't touch really at this point on in terms of appointments. The fiscal challenges and opportunities. Well, I think it's a good idea that the government has sort of scaled down and focused these pandemic support programs. And one of the big issues now, of course, is inflation. Is it transitory or more permanent? And the head of the Bank of Canada yesterday said it's transitory, but a little more longer lasting than they thought. But I'm really of the party that says that, yes, of course, we're going to have some inflation, but I have seen at the pretty close level the commitment of the Bank of Canada and the federal government to price stability. So I'm pretty sure they won't let it get out of control on a sort of a structural basis. The federal deficits and debt, Frank touched on that as well. You know, in terms of debt to GDP, which is one of the very recognized measures, Canada for this fiscal year will, on a net debt basis, will be 51.2% of federal debt to GDP and projected to be 49.2% debt to GDP by year 22-23, which is quite manageable, and in relation to other OECD countries, quite manageable. Now, there is some new thinking coming out in terms of modern monetary theory, and another book you may want to have a bash at is The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. She's one of the leaders of this movement. And when you read the book, you discover that basically they're saying there's no need to worry in Canada about the debt or the deficits, because we are a currency issuing government. We have monetary sovereignty. We can make as much money as we want or issue it as much as we want. The only constraint they do talk about is the impact potentially on inflation, but that hinges too on how close we are to full employment. Anyway, I read the book. I'm not sure I'm converted, but it's certainly pushing the envelope on some new thinking. The constitutional and policy challenges. Frank had some of these on his slides. I'm not going to get into it in any depth, but they had the Bill 96 out of the legislature in Quebec. I'm sure that the Quebec government dumped that into the laps of the leaders just before the federal election to sort of really crank them up a bit. And you could see the leaders were a bit evasive around it. I think I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I'll have to confess that, but I think the chances of that making it into the Canadian Constitution, both provisions on, well, Quebec as a nation has already been, a motion came to that effect to the House of Commons and was adopted. But a lot of these things hinge on what effects they'll have on other provinces. And I think that even the official languages could be a barrier, but we'll have to see how that plays out. Of course, we have Indigenous reconciliation, equalization. Of course, Jason Kenney is having a referendum on equalization. I think that will just end up shedding more light on the issue. But I think it's time that the equalization program be looked at again. And at the very, very least, that it's communicated much better to the Canadian population what it is. I mean, I've been at briefings on it, and it's your sort of eyes glaze over. It's fairly complicated, but I think it needs a second look. What we're seeing now, I think, is a lot of labor market structural changes, where a lot of the people were thinking, oh, if they just increase wages in the restaurants, or now that the restaurants are coming back, they'll all come back, and the chambermaids, and I don't think that's happening. And it's not happening because they were collecting, you know, some of this money on the pandemic programs from the feds. It's a lot of it, these people, I think, have re-examined their careers and have moved to other industries, increased their skill sets. They have, yeah, so I think that's in play big time as well. We have the Huawei issue, and I think now that the two Michaels are back, I expect, to be honest, I'm hoping that Canada makes the decision to not allow Huawei into the Canada's 5G network, mostly because I think it's really important for Canada to be an active participant in the Five Eyes. And we've already seen that the Three Eyes have got together with the submarine program in respect of China. And I think that for a variety of reasons, it's happened that way, but I think there's another signal there that Canada, we have to be a trusted partner. And I, for one, don't think that Huawei is a good bet for Canada. Gun control, I remember in the 2006 general election, Paul Martin, the Prime Minister, came to my riding and he said, if we're reelected, we will ban handguns completely. Obviously, we made provisions for serious shooters in competitive competitions and with significant protocols for gun clubs. But in any case, of course, we lost the election in 2006, so that couldn't happen. So the federal government has launched initiatives with respect to these assault weapons, which to me is a no-brainer. The big ticket item for me is the scope he's giving to the municipalities to bring in some changes with respect to handguns. And it's mostly a rural urban issue. Whether the municipalities will pick up on this or not, I don't know. If they don't, I think it would be wise for the feds to take it back and have another look and see what should be done about that. So public service impacts, well, very specifically, sort of rubber hitting the road stuff is the question of fully vaccinated civil servants and employees of federally regulated industries is obviously a big issue for the public service. And of course, the House of Commons has now got the same sort of rule. You have to be vaccinated to come to the chamber in person. Of course, movement away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. This is the big challenge, and there has to be some incentives, some push to make that happen. And one of the positive things too, I think, is renewable energy costs are coming way down. So on a strictly cost basis, apart from infrastructure and what have you, I think there's some directional things happening there. Climate change, reconciliation, implementing the commitments from the last budget in the minority parliament. And we can see that Mr. Trudeau and his government is chatting away with the NDP. I don't think it'll be a formal coalition. I think Mr. Dion tried that once and that didn't work, but there'll probably be some agreement on various initiatives that the NDP would like to see. And rather than getting their votes lined up on every confidence vote, maybe some program that is acceptable to all parties. The Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers have illustrated the huge problem with tax evasion and money laundering. I've done a lot of work in the fight against money laundering, and there's a public inquiry right now in British Columbia. So I think that has to be tackled seriously. We have a new national childcare program, which the civil service will have to help guide and implement. And of course, the new portfolio for mental health and addictions. So I'd really like to spend the last couple of minutes, if I could, just to talk about the public the interface between the political arm and the public servant arm. As I said, as David introduced me, I was an assistant deputy minister for 8 years in the BC Ministry of Forests. And then, of course, I was an elected MP for 12. So I've seen it to some extent from both sides. And I think some of the key points that I've made before to groups like this are the need for the relationship to be based on trust, respect, confidence, and a communication. Communication is absolutely key. Discretion, confidentiality. Civil servants can't be running off to the media unless there's a strategy that's been approved, by all concerned. Officials should offer policy advice in terms of options, typically, and not only put forward the option that they prefer and then a couple of throwaway options, because that just defeats the trust between the two branches of government, to put forward serious options and a recommendation as well. Officials, of course, must be nonpartisan and discreet. Both sides should practice transparency. And of course, we know that the public service has the advantage of institutional memory and content expertise. the political arm has the advantage of being elected by the people of Canada. So both branches need to respect and understand that dynamic. I think that the other thing is that civil servants, sometimes when the trust breaks down between the political arm and the civil servants are reluctant to put forward options that have some risk attached to them. I think I would caution against that. And I think there was a speaker earlier in the conference that said, yeah, don't be shy, don't be timid, and also don't be timid about telling the minister or an elected official that they're making a mistake, that there's some problems afoot. Warn them. Early warning is good for any elected person. And also, if there are any issues around probity or anything of that nature, that civil servants would make the elected person aware of that. So at an early stage. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm looking forward to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Roy. And lastly, I will like to introduce Winter Fedek. Winter is the Director of Silo Strategy, a project management and public policy consulting firm. She is also an associate with Think Digital, which focuses on digital transformation for the public good. Prior to taking the leap to the private sector, Winter was a long-time public servant and has over 20 years of experience working with governments at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels. In 2018, Winter won the National IPAC Social Leadership Award for her role in organizing the Public Policy Book Club in Regina. Winter loves to connect with people and ideas and is eagerly awaiting the revolution. I love that. Winter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be on such an esteemed panel and to have gotten to hear such amazing speakers. In particular, Frank Graves, I have followed your Twitter account over the election, and so getting to meet you today was a real pleasure. When I started to think about what I wanted to say today around, the role of the public service after the last election, I've really been thinking a lot about whether or not it can be business as usual for the public service. And so I want to share a bit of perspective on that today, because for me, the question isn't how the public service can deliver on all the big challenges that both Frank and Roy were talking about, but whether it can at all. I'm not sure that it's a guarantee that the public service has the time, the tools, or the temerity to tackle some of the big challenges that Canadians face. And so I want to dig into that a little bit. But before I do, I just want to talk a little bit about my background, because of course I'm bringing some bias to the table. If you could just move the slide, that would be great. So I want to make sure that you have a sense of the lens through which I view these kinds of questions. I'm a white middle-class woman from Regina. I've lived in Saskatchewan for most of my life. I was really fortunate to have supportive parents who supported me financially and morally to go to university, where I studied political science and English, and then eventually received a master's of public administration degree. And this gave me the credentials I needed to be hired into the public service, first as a junior student employment program manager in Saskatchewan, and most recently as the executive director of social services. In 2019, I left the public service proper to start my own consulting firm called Silo Strategy, where I still do public service work, but not technically as a public servant. Over 20 years, I've worked for 5 different political administrations in 3 different jurisdictions. Those are dotted on the map there. And I've had a bird's eye view into where the rubber hits the road in terms of policy and implementation, as most of my time has been in central agency roles such as Privy Council Office, Finance, Treasury Board Secretariat, those kinds of functions. And so the perspective that I'm bringing today really is about the patterns that I've seen across the systems, rather than any reference to any particular government or administration. And so if there's any lawyers in the crowd for you right now, that was my disclaimer. But I'm going to move on in terms of the answer, going back to that question I posed earlier around whether or not the public service is going to be able to deliver on some of the big challenges. Here we've got a big list of all of the things that didn't get talked about in the last election, as Frank rightly mentioned. And these are some big challenges that we have in front of us. I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but I do want to tell a couple of stories that illustrate maybe where my perspective is coming from. The first story relates to the second last bullet there around infrastructure failure. Right now I'm in Iqaluit, where it's over a month into a drinking water emergency. They found hydrocarbons contaminating the water supply just over a month ago. And ever since then, we've had to drink water out of bottles that have been flown up from Ottawa. Locals have been going to the river to fill up big jugs so that they can cook with, but that's not going to be able to last too long because it's starting to freeze up now. At the same time as the crisis was emerging in Iqaluit, the Alberta government held a referendum around equalization. And the question that they posed to voters there was whether it was fair for Canada's richest jurisdiction, the folks there, to pay a little bit more into the Canadian pot than they get back. And the answer was no. And that was really striking to me, given everything that's happening right now where I'm at. The second story I want to tell you is about the last bullet there around the policy and delivery institutional stress. And when I'm talking about policy there, I'm not just talking about the, the policy shop on the second floor of the office. I'm talking about policy writ large. Frank kind of touched on this a little bit, but I really think that there are some big questions around whether not just the public sector is able to deliver on for Canadians, but whether political parties are as well. And the story I want to tell is about the day after the election, when I opened up Twitter to see what people were having to say, and saw a tweet from Gerald Butts, who was the former senior advisor to the Prime Minister, and where he was talking about a firm called Data Sciences, and said basically that this firm, which is a data mining company, is the reason that the Liberals were able to gain a minority government despite having only 31% of the popular vote. And for me, that was really affirming something that I had been thinking about for quite a while, and that's whether the nature of political parties has changed so much that they're not fulfilling their basic function in our democracy about aggregating those interests. I think somebody earlier talked about brokerage parties and the need for political parties to aggregate those interests on the ground and then develop that platform that they take to Canadians. And that's how we based our democracy over the last number of decades. And that tweet just affirmed to me that if the role of political parties now is not to aggregate interests on the ground, but it's just to target through data mining where the most efficient way to get their vote is, it makes me question whether or not we're even having those conversations that we need to have, and whether or not the public service is going to be able to deliver because of that. The next slide talks a little bit more about the future state. So there's a big long list there on the current state, but there's a couple of other things that are going to, I think, add to that in the future. And I won't go into that too much either, except to say, I don't want to be overly pessimistic about the state of things, because we've had challenges as Canadians, the Canadian project for, 150 years or so. We had a pandemic in 1918. We had 2 world wars. We came out of that. So what's different about today? One of the things I think is different about today is that we also have 50 plus years of building up a complex and complicated welfare state that has been underfunded in a lot of cases, and so it's very fragile. So it's not a case of just building back better, but it's also a case of looking at what we currently have that exists and fixing that. And in a lot of cases, that's a very difficult thing to do. There was an earlier presentation around change management, and that would be a fun activity for any of you new professionals out there, is to go find somebody in the office who's been around for a while and talk to them about the most successful change management initiatives that they've been part of in their organization, because it's a difficult thing to do. And irrespective of climate change, irrespective of the pandemic or all of these other challenges, I think that the biggest challenge that we face as public servants is changing our own minds, changing our own ways of doing things. And so, we've got some work to do ahead. The next slide just talks about some of the considerations to think about as we go forward. Of course, we can't predict the future, but it's barreling down on us. So what should we think about? One of the things is, scale and capacity to deliver. And I think that this really comes from my experience working for Canada's biggest government and now the smallest government, that, a policy is not a policy across Canada. And even though there are obvious similarities, the capacity that governments have to deliver goods or services and those kinds of things to its citizens is really different across this country. And so I think we need to be mindful of that as we go forward, because it has an impact. You know, there's a lot of use of consultants like myself. And so, you know, there's some considerations there around if we don't have the capacity as public servants to do it all ourselves, how do we get help, but how do we maintain institutional integrity when we get that help? Because there's a real risk of having people in decision makers' ears who don't have to have the accountability for actually delivering on those things. With respect to decision making and bias, I think, you know, I think it was Tony Dean who talked about there's a lot of policy actors in the system right now who do have the ear of decision makers. But the thing that the public service has that nobody else does, which is really special and important, is we set the table for decision makers when they're making their decisions. And so what we feed them when they're making those decisions is really, really important. And it's a real privilege as a public servant to have that influence. And so, you know, just the integrity of the decision-making processes and being very conscious and intentional about the bias through that process, recognizing your own bias as a public servant is very, very important. And I think that those are some key things that the public service needs to consider going forward. My last slide really is just, you know, if I could say what are the three things that the new public servant should think about going forward in this very complicated, complex time. Roy just touched on this around fearless advice and loyal implementation. When I first learned about this concept 20 years ago when I was studying public administration, it was fairly abstract what this meant. Over time, it's got a little bit more meat on its bones. And I'm really interested to see where this goes forward. You know, the public perception of the loyal implementation part post-pandemic. I think about the chief medical health officers, for example, and people in various jurisdictions asking about whether or not those need to be autonomous positions because they're concerned about, you know, the fact that those public servants maybe are loyally implementing and maybe the public doesn't want that. So, but that's part of the job because decision makers do need to trust the public service. And so it is still, I think, the #1 point of the job. Second one is continuous learning. As a new public servant, don't expect anybody to be in control or in charge of your learning. You are in control yourself. And not every organization that you work for is going to have a big budget for this. So you're going to have to improvise. And here's where I'll also do a plug for IPAC, because I first started with IPAC when I was living in Ottawa, and I was on the board of directors there of the National Capital Region. And then I joined IPAC Saskatchewan when I moved back home in 2010 as well. And, you know, throughout it all, IPAC has been, I've got some great friends out of the organization, some great learning opportunities. And in those cases where it was a hard conversation to have at work, I would take that conversation to my colleagues through IPAC to have those conversations, because you'll never find another group of people who are as passionate about the public service as the people who are involved there. So definitely get involved. And then the last point I'll say is to find your partners. The public service can't do it all on its own. Partnerships are important, everything from large institutional partnerships. And here I'll do a little plug for the board I'm on for Code for Canada. They work with government organizations at all levels to facilitate digital transformation for the public good. And these are the kinds of organizations that the public service needs to get comfortable working with more and more, because as we've talked about, we have some pretty big challenges in front of us as Canadians, as citizens of the world. Whether or not our institutions, including the public service, including political parties, you know, and other actors in the system are up to that challenge is, I'm not there yet that I could say for sure it's going to happen. So we need to talk to each other. We need to figure those out, those opportunities to work together out. And so I'll just conclude with that, saying again, you know, find your partners, including IPAC. And again, thank you so much for inviting me today. And stay in touch. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Winter. I know we are just slightly over our time right now, but we do have time to answer a few questions, and there are a couple that are in the chat. So I'll start off, and I believe this is for the group. So the question is, where is the disconnect between the making of policy and its implementation? Why does it take so long to take concrete steps? So maybe thinking in the context of obviously going into a minority situation and talking about maybe some of the priorities that have either been identified by the public or been identified by our speakers. Any perspective on that disconnect between the making of policy and implementation and moving it forward? Anybody want to start with that one? Go ahead, Roy. Yep.
I can give you an example. Having in a minority government, I remember at the time I was working with Anne McClellan as her parliamentary secretary, and I went to the RCMP headquarters and I was having the tour, and I went through the DNA lab, and I had 2 or 3 officers come over to me and they said, Mr. Cullen, we're not getting all the DNA that we should be getting for, convicted criminals. So I went and talked to Erwin Cotler, who was the Minister of Justice at the time. And I said, Erwin, what's the problem? And he said, I think that the problem is that the crowns and the judges are not filling in the forms and not consciously thinking that they've got to fill in something to instruct the DNA to go to the DNA lab. And he said, so I'm going to mount an education program. So anyway, his office happened to be right across from mine in the West Block. So I have a chance to check with him, and as my staff would, and a few months went by and nothing seemed to be happening. So we were at committee, it was the Justice Committee, and this was a minority government, as I said, and we were dealing with a DNA Act, mostly housekeeping stuff, but a few other things. And the parliamentary secretary for the Minister of Justice was leading the bill at committee at clause by clause. And right at the clause by clause time, the opposition critic in the Conservative Party for public safety, sorry, I can hear someone else's voice. The public safety, Vic Tays actually, he presented an amendment that would give the judge no discretion. So in other words, for any convicted criminal, the DNA would automatically go to the RCMP lab. And the list was long for the offenses that they covered. Of course, if someone won on appeal and were proved to be innocent, the DNA would come out of the lab. But so anyway, I looked at this amendment and I thought this is the sort of thing that, it interested me a lot. So I turned to my colleague, the parliamentary secretary, the Minister of Justice, and I said, now, could you give me an example, you and your officials, of when it would be in the national interest or the public interest for the DNA not to go to the DNA lab at the RCMP? And they huddled for, it seemed like an eternity. And they came back and they said, well, we can't think of any example. And I said, well, fine, I'm supporting this motion by the Conservative Party. And even the Bloc, members of the committee, who are normally pretty left on this stuff, they said, we're going to support it as well. And so we actually, overnight, we set the clause aside because the list was too long. Like they included everything to, pickpocketing and stuff. I'm using exaggeration. So overnight, we reduced the list of the most heinous of crimes, murder, rape, manslaughter, burglary, armed robbery. And we came back the next day and we approved clause by clause with those small changes, the whole bill clause by clause. It went to the House of Commons and was passed. So that's the power of a minority parliament. On this, by the same token, if it's a minority parliament, and I'm sure that the government of the day wasn't thrilled with that, but nonetheless it got done. As I mentioned earlier, the power of a majority government, and I had one of those with Mr. Chrétien's first government, is we go to committee and it was basically, you just line up the ducks and off you go. One of the things I did as parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance is I said to the opposition parties, I said, look, if you're going to introduce an amendment, if it's just for grandstanding or, political mileage, forget it. If you give me 2 days notice and you table the amendment or you tell me you're going to table it, I will review it with the department. I will review it with the minister if it gets that stage. And I'll come back to you with a real answer. We'll either accept it or we'll reject it. But if you just table it at the last minute, forget it. And that seemed to work, and people, respected that. And So I think that that's at that sort of level. The other level, of course, is just that it's fine to have policy, but the rubber really hits the road in terms of after the legislation, in terms of the regulations, and then the regulations, then they drive the whole implementation schedule, which can be quite onerous in filling out all those details. So I think there'll always be those lags between making policy and implementation, and some of them are real, some of them would be nefarious. I mean, the bureaucracy dragging their feet because they don't like it, but if you have a good minister, the minister will, generally be on top of that.
Great. I apologize to everybody. We're at 5 o'clock and we're probably a bit over our time right now. So if I can, I'd like to thank Winter, Roy, and Frank for your presentations today, and and thanks to IPAC for allowing us to be part of your day. And I will turn it back over to Ashley.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dave, Winter, Frank, and Roy for being here and providing your insight and your perspective. Today's first session of the National New Professionals event was packed, and it's still packed because we have a networking portion to our event today. So please stay tuned for that. But we have a giveaway, and I want to thank Winter for donating this giveaway. She'll be sponsoring a membership. So instead of you getting 1 year membership, you're going to be extended to 2 years of IPAC membership. And drum roll, please. The winner of the extension of the membership is Rosemary Jones from Manitoba. If she is on here, you can say hello, introduce yourself. If not, we will connect with you after the event. So my colleague Erin now will be setting us up for the breakout sessions so we can have informal networking. Again, stretch your legs, grab a drink, and come back and meet some of your fellow public policy, public administrators, public servants.